Chapter 199, Sirius is Thinking. Walking out of the office, Regulus made his slow way toward the library, his footsteps echoing down the stone corridor. McGonagall's words still turned over in his head. Position, relationship, points on the timeline, what can be changed and what cannot. The professor's meaning was clear enough in the abstract. He understood each word and, taken together, what she was trying to convey. But when he tried to imagine combining those ideas with transfiguration, he couldn't picture it. A table has its position, a room has its position, any object has its position. If those positions were altered, would they remain the same thing? He thought of a match and the box it sits in, of the hand that strikes it and the instant it flares. If all those relationships change, is it still the same match? And the points on the timeline. Regulus replayed what he'd just done, turning oak into linden. That match was made at one time, picked up at another, transfigured at a third. The material had changed, but those temporal points still existed. The moment of production, the moment it was picked up, the moment it was altered. What if someday someone could change those moments too? Change the time a match was made from last year to 100 years ago, or change the moment it is struck from the next second to never. The match would still be the match, but what exactly would have been altered? Or would nothing really be different at all? Regulus had no answer, only wonder. Transfiguration was miraculous. It seemed endless. Every field, every branch of the art offered a lifetime of work. There was always another path forward. Of course, only a very few wizards could walk those paths indefinitely. For most, transfiguration had a limit. Then there was fate. He'd asked McGonagall, "Is that fate?" She'd replied, "Not fate, position." But the question lingered. What was fate? Viewed along the timeline, perhaps fate was the sum of what had happened, what was happening, and what was to come. A person acts at a certain time and causes a consequence, which causes the next consequence, and so on, one link after another, like a river. Was what he'd experienced in Germany, the schemes Grindelwald set in motion, the battles ending up in the sleeping sea abyss, an interference with fate? Regulus decided probably not. Interfering with fate would be yanking someone off an original path and shoving them onto another. But his path had already been like that. Grindelwald had seen his route and placed a few markers along the way. Whether he followed them was up to him. And even without those markers, would he have ended up elsewhere? He couldn't say. Thinking it over felt pointless. Fate only mattered to those who could perceive it. For those who could see the river, fate was something to watch from the bank. For those swimming in the water, fate was simply the water itself. No time to hypothesize about its source or destination, only to keep swimming without drowning. Regulus thought he belonged to the swimmers. He didn't know where he'd finish up, but for now he was managing quite well. School had only been in session a few days, and already 2 professors had taken him aside, Slughorn and McGonagall. They hadn't taught him any specific new spells or techniques. What they'd given him was a concept, a philosophical way of thinking about transfiguration. What it is, how far it can go, the truly deep territories. Regulus couldn't help but wonder why. Had he shown something in class that caught their attention and prompted their guidance, or had they been waiting for him to reach a point where this level of mentoring was necessary? Maybe both. It didn't matter. Regardless of intent, he had heard them and remembered their reasoning, and that was enough. He had to admit they had both been very generous. His mind settled on the small spatial transfiguration he'd performed in the office. Though only the size of a palm and a rudimentary distortion, it had been his own work. The further refinement from his star orbit meditation had brought overall improvement. His spirit was stronger, his control of transfiguration more precise, his understanding deeper. Space magic had always been his focus. From space leap to teleportation charms, from space anchor to this little distortion, every step had been slow but steady, and every step forward. Having begun, the prospects looked bright. He quickened his pace. On the 3rd floor, the 3rd years were in defense against the dark arts. Gryffindor and Slytherin sat in separated clusters, several rows of empty desks between them. The air had that faint tang of gunpowder. The 2 houses were barely keeping their peace. The new teacher for the subject this year stood at the lectern, a tall, thin man in his 40s with neat hair and a sharp gaze. Ezra Vance, speaking with a light Irish lilt. Dark creatures, he said, sweeping the room with his eyes, are one of the threats the wizarding world faces. You learned some basic countermeasures in earlier years, but that is far from enough. With a quick flick of his wand, several lines of text appeared on the board. Werewolf, Dementor, Redcap, Grindylow. Today, he said, we'll start with the most common ones. Anyone know what the most effective countermeasure is when encountering a werewolf? He asked. The students muttered and debated. Vance let them discuss for a moment, and then called on Potter. Mr. Potter. James stood with a roguish grin. Run. A low laugh rippled through the class. Vance's face didn't change. Run? Where would you run to? James nodded at Sirius. Run to a crowd, maybe. Werewolves lose themselves on full moon nights, but they avoid crowds. Wait, no, that's wrong. They just charge into crowds. Vance looked at him without blinking. So? James shrugged. So running's useless. Use a spell? Stupefy? A binding charm? Vance shook his head. Werewolves have an extraordinary resistance to ordinary spells. With your power, a stupefy might at best singe a few hairs. James frowned. Then what should we do? Vance let the silence hang a moment, then addressed the class. The most dangerous thing about werewolves isn't just their strength, it's their concealment. Most of the time they look like ordinary people and only transform on the night of the full moon. So the most effective countermeasure is identification. His gaze swept the room. Only by knowing who is a werewolf can you avoid them. Only by knowing who they are can you be prepared when they transform. Only by knowing can you protect yourselves. How do you identify them? He asked. The room went quiet. All eyes were on him. Vance looked satisfied. In their human form, werewolves have no obvious differences from others, yet there are subtle signs. They are unusually sensitive to silver, their sense of smell can be far keener than normal, and they tend to be inexplicably exhausted around the full moon. Of course, the most direct way is to observe patterns, disappearing for a few fixed days each month and coming back each time looking as though they've been gravely ill, if you notice someone like that. James drifted, flipping through his book and making small comments about the illustrations. Sirius's attention, however, was fixed on the word on the board, werewolf. He thought of Remus, how Remus asked for leave around the same dates each month, saying he was sick, how those absences were always fixed around the full moon. Each time Remus returned, his complexion was drained, as if he'd endured terrible things. Sirius remembered waking in the night to find Remus's bed empty and asking him about it the next day. Remus had said he'd been to the hospital wing. But Sirius, who frequented the hospital wing, knew the scent of disinfectant, and Remus had not smelled of it. Now Remus sat across from James, head bowed, his face gray. His hand trembled as he gripped the quill. He was nervous. Sirius tore his gaze away. Werewolf. Full moon nights. Fixed absences. The professor talking about it. Remus looking ill and refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The fragments formed a vague, dangerous picture, and Sirius felt its pieces fit together. He wasn't certain, but a suspicion had taken root. Vance waited a bit longer, and when no one answered, he moved on, covering Dementors, how to identify them and defend against them, then the weaknesses of Redcaps and the habitats of Grindylows. He moved quickly. There was a lot to say, and most of the students wrote furiously. Sirius took notes, but his thoughts were already elsewhere, on Remus. If his suspicion was true, what should he do? Remus was like a brother. They'd shared a bed for over 2 years, pulled pranks together, stayed up late talking, and spent Christmases at James's house. If Remus had this problem, how could Sirius respond? Cast him out? Shun him? Sirius swore silently. No, there was no way he could do that. Of course not. Remus was Remus, no matter what. James didn't seem to have noticed. He still scribbled happily, but Sirius needed to check with him. He knew how James would decide. That careless face hid a resolute heart, especially about friends. Their group had never cared much for the rules. Sirius forced himself to focus on his notes, having already decided what he would do. The bell rang. Vance closed his book. Next week, we'll cover boggarts and redcaps. Go preview the material. Students spilled out into the corridor. James stretched and grinned. This teacher's good, doesn't mince words. Remus stayed silent, packing slowly. James clapped a hand on his shoulder. Come on, let's go eat. Remus forced a smile. You go on, I have something to take care of. James frowned. Always something with you. It's nothing really. Go ahead. He tried to smooth the lie. James looked between him and Sirius, then shrugged and left with Sirius. Peter darted after them. Remus stayed behind, head bowed, motionless for a long moment. Then, finally, he rose, packed his bag, and walked out of the classroom alone. Chapter 200. I Really Want to Laugh. 8 p.m. Room of Requirement. School had been back in session for nearly a week before Avery and Alex showed up for the first time. It wasn't that they'd spent the whole week loafing and suddenly decided to get productive. Avery, at least, hadn't played enough yet. It was Alex who had taken the initiative the previous night, saying he wanted to keep training under Regulus's guidance. He was always the more conscientious one. Dumbledore's term-opening speech, the newly added defense against the dark arts classes, the furtive looks shared by upper years in the corridors, an indefinable tension had settled over the Slytherin common room. Some were excited, some nervous, some pretended nothing was happening. Alex felt that mood spreading. Not all students were like that. Those who lived to play couldn't be bothered with it. As long as their homework was done and their grades were passable, what else mattered besides fun? But Alex was different. Even a mild-mannered pureblood was still a pureblood, and a Slytherin who didn't want trouble was still a Slytherin. Whether from an unease he couldn't name or a desire for the power to protect himself and his family, he felt it was time to learn something real. Besides, having someone like Regulus as a resource and not taking advantage of it felt like a waste. Others would kill for this chance. Alex sometimes wondered if his roommate had been someone else, if Regulus would have taken that person into his small circle instead. He recognized his own luck for what it was. Regulus had even said luck was part of strength, and the sentiment sat with Alex as truth. So after a week of term, he spoke up. Avery, meanwhile, had enjoyed a pleasant holiday and kept playing even after term began. During the day, they were together. At night, when Regulus and Hermes slipped away, Avery looked the other way. There was too much to do if you wanted to play. Quidditch, wizard's chess, exploding snap, exploring the castle's hidden corners. A few friendly matches with the boys in the next dorm, or long stretches on the common room sofa, doing absolutely nothing. Life suited him. But he wasn't stupid. Regulus was clearly the group's center, and by numbers it was 2 against 2, Alex and Avery versus Regulus and Hermes. If one pair was working, the other couldn't just be left behind. So Avery came along too. He also knew this opportunity was rare. The Casbert family had resources. They could hire tutors and find ancient tomes if they wanted. But that wasn't the same as what Regulus could offer. A paid teacher teaches because they are paid. Regulus taught because he regarded them like his own. Avery understood that perfectly. Regulus looked at them and saw it all. One came out of unease, seeking security through training. The other followed so he wouldn't be left out. Either way, taking the initiative to come was something to be praised. He would never force anyone. Power had to be desired. Forced practice teaches nothing real. With Sirius, he might give a taste and create a hunger for strength, but with the others, he would limit himself. Now they had come voluntarily, and it was only a week into term. Young students actively choosing to train made Regulus feel a little gratified. "Spar first," he said. "Let me see what you picked up over the holidays." Avery and Alex exchanged a look and drew their wands. Regulus stepped aside and watched. In truth, he didn't need to. A quick sweep with magical perception told him their state. There had been growth, but it was mostly the natural growth of a year older, not much to do with dedicated practice. They were at a normal second-year level, maybe a shade above. Avery struck first. "Expelliarmus!" A red beam shot toward Alex. He sidestepped and fired back. "Impedimenta." Avery was hit and staggered, but recovered quickly, countering with a stupefy. They traded spells loudly, making a show of it. Their footwork had improved from last term. They dodged sideways and sought cover. Occasionally, one would avoid a spell cleanly, and sometimes a decent attack landed. But to Regulus, it was all too slow. Spells soft, their trajectories obvious as if cast in slow motion. They lacked speed, power, and precision. He thought a muggle or a squib of the same age, given a few days of training, might even be able to pose a real threat. "Stop," Regulus called. They halted, panting slightly. Avery smiled at Alex. "Not bad, you made some progress." Alex smiled back shyly, cheeks flushed. You too. They felt they'd had a good, even fight. Hermes watched from the side, lip twitching. He wanted to shake his head. These two had clearly done nothing useful over the holidays. Regulus ignored the snide thought and pushed open a door. Follow me. They went through, and the scene changed. They stepped into a spacious practice arena with stone walls and a shaded skylight. In the center, a dozen wooden dummies, life-sized, stood scattered, each holding a fake wand and perfectly still. This is the practice field, Regulus said. The dummies move and cast spells. Their intensity is fixed. They won't injure you, but you'll feel it if you're hit. He looked at them. Both of you go in. Practice until you can stay inside for 10 minutes without being hit. Avery blinked at the dummies. 10 minutes? Think that's too little? Regulus asked. Make it 20. Avery shut his mouth. Regulus continued his instructions. Don't try to tank hits. The dummies cast Expelliarmus and Impedimenta. If you get hit, your wand will fly from your hand or you'll be frozen in place. If you can't avoid a hit, use a shield charm to block, but shield charms consume magical energy and won't last long. Use the terrain, the gaps between dummies, and the intervals in their casting. Go in. Avery and Alex exchanged another look, took deep breaths, and stepped onto the field. The dummies turned to face them. Regulus watched for a moment and nodded. This would trouble them. Then he turned to Hermes. Spar. Hermes hesitated, thinking. His progress over the holidays had been massive. Training and real combat had shown him real danger. He felt he could defeat his last-term self in a few moves. But fighting Regulus seemed to prove nothing. There was too big a gap. In their duel the previous term, he'd used everything he had, and Regulus had barely lifted his wand. Now Hermes had improved, but what of Regulus? Regulus's work in potions over the week had been on a different level entirely. A fight wouldn't reveal much. Regulus saw the hesitation. Just focus on attacking. That was enough. All right, Hermes said. He drew his wand, stepped back into stance, and struck. His first spell, a dark arts curse he drilled over the holidays, shot out. Bone and blood stripping. A dark red beam drove toward Regulus's chest. Hermes had practiced this relentlessly. Its power and his casting speed were far greater than last term. Regulus didn't move. The spell hit and met a faint flash of silver that dissipated the beam. Hermes followed instantly. Shadow binding bite! Black tendrils erupted from the ground toward Regulus's ankles. Regulus lifted a foot and brought it down. The tendrils were crushed. Hermes darted around, casting as he moved. Tearing shadow, a black blade slashed through the air. Corrosive touch. A cloud of dark green mist began to spread. Blood-boiling curse, bone-corroding curse, entrail expelling curse. The spells came in succession, fast and slow, frontal and lateral, everything he'd honed over the holidays. His footwork was more flexible, his control of magical energy had improved, and the spells had real bite. Regulus, however, simply kept walking forward. His wand was in hand but never raised to cast, and he didn't employ an obvious translucent shield charm. When the curses struck, only occasional silver flashes popped up. The constant protective magic Regulus wove was different now. Since the warding had been activated, his defensive magic had become instinctive. As spells approached, a silver light would automatically flare and dissipate them. He didn't need to do anything. Hermes's offense was fierce and showed real work. He used the dark arts much more deftly than last term, and his feints were better. A few spells almost slipped past Regulus's perception until the last moment. But all of it fell short. Not fast enough, strong enough, sudden enough, or deep enough. The power behind Hermes's spells dwindled. His movements slowed as his magical energy and stamina burned out. Regulus stopped. That's enough. He walked over and patted Hermes on the shoulder. Great progress. Hermes looked up, chest heaving. Your spell intensity has doubled since last term, Regulus went on. Your casting speed is faster, your footwork is more flexible, and you hide your intentions better. There were a few spells I only noticed when they were right in front of me. Hermes tried to smile, sweat soaking his hair, face grimy, and the grin came out edged with exhaustion. He caught himself and relaxed. Regulus continued, but there are problems. Hermes waited for the critique. You rely too much on the power of the dark arts, Regulus said. You tune every spell for maximum lethality and burn through your energy. By the end, you couldn't even reach a third of your potential. Hermes thought it over and had to admit he was right. Control your rhythm, Regulus advised. Reserve high power for when it's needed. Use smaller spells when appropriate. Don't let your opponent read your pattern. Hermes nodded. Regulus patted him again. Rest. They both looked toward the practice field. Avery and Alex were running in a panic among the dummies. Avery's wand had already been knocked away, and he was bent over searching the floor. A dummy stalked after him, its fake wand firing relentlessly. Avery cursed as he dodged. Alex was doing a little better, his wand still in hand, but 3 dummies had him cornered, and he was holding a shield charm to soak the hits. The charm was on the verge of shattering. His face was pale, and his forehead beaded with sweat. A spell struck, and Alex's shield burst. He froze, immobile. A dummy loomed and raised its fake wand, pointing it at his face. Avery had finally found his wand again, but when he stood up, he was smacked by another Expelliarmus and watched it fly from his hand once more. He swore even louder. Regulus watched the scene unfold. Hermes' lip twitched again. This time, he really wanted to laugh. Avery and Alex left first. On the walk back, neither said much. It wasn't like when they'd arrived. Avery had been joking then about showing Regulus how much he'd improved that night. Alex had felt the same way, though he hadn't said it out loud. They could both feel the change in themselves. Their magic felt more obedient. Spells that had been difficult last year came more easily, and some routines no longer needed conscious thought. The magic moved, and the spells happened. They took it as progress, and in a sense it was. They didn't know this was simply part of growing up for young wizards. Magical power tends to settle and become easier to wield with age. It isn't only practice or talent, it's also natural development. Those thoughts drifted away quickly. Show Regulus their progress? After what had just happened, the joke felt hollow. Their clumsy attempts against the dummies, the weak spells, their uncertain dodges, all of it had been exposed. Silence settled between them. They'd long accepted that Regulus was on a different plane. For pureblood families, that was an old lesson. Some children were stronger, or showed their talent earlier. It was part of life. At family gatherings, elders would point to a cousin and say this child's magic showed early, and fathers would read names in the paper and nod that their line had produced someone notable. Talent seemed fixed. Resentment didn't help. You accepted it. Regulus was simply built differently, whether by talent, bloodline, or something else. But Regulus had another contrast to Hermes. He treated Hermes differently, not in manners so much as in the look he gave him. The way Regulus looked at Hermes was like looking at someone who could understand what he was doing. The look he gave Avery and Alex was the look one gives children who need to be led. Avery felt a flare of indignation, but he knew the truth. Hermes had come farther than he had. The distance was visible in Hermes' speed, the power behind his spells, and the fluidity of his movement. Avery could see where Hermes' strength lay. He understood the dark arts, even if he couldn't perform them yet, and he could picture the work it would take to reach that level. Maybe, he thought, if he learned a few of those powerful curses and practiced the dark arts, he could close the gap. The House of Casbert could not be weaker than Mulciber's, let alone the House of Black. He decided, with equal parts pride and frustration, that he would try. Alex felt none of the guilty urgency. Being weak was simply a condition. There was nothing shameful in aligning oneself with the strong. His father had taught him that it was survival wisdom. Not everyone stands on the peak, but you can stand beside it. In the room of requirement, Hermes had not left. Normally, he would have gone with Avery and the others, but that evening, he stayed. Regulus glanced at him, but said nothing. If he wanted to stay, he could. After finishing practice with the others, Regulus needed time for his own training. He walked toward a stretch of wall and thought of needing a private chamber. The masonry rippled as if made of liquid and reshaped itself. A door formed out of nothing. He pushed it open to reveal a small room, not large, but enough. He stepped inside and the door closed behind him. Hermes stood where he was and stared at the closed door. When it shut, he felt a kind of exclusion, more than physical. The sense that Regulus was about to work on something private, something advanced. He shouldn't be curious. It was Regulus's business, and even if he watched, he might not understand. Still, curiosity tugged at him. He thought back to his own performance. He had used everything he'd practiced over the holidays, every dark arts technique he'd mastered. Each could be lethal. His father had said that, at his current level, he could handle 6th or 7th year students. But Regulus hadn't raised his wand or put up a shield charm when those spells hit. There had only been a flash of silver light and then nothing. Hermes had been helpless against that calm, effortless dominance. His father, too, could suppress him with a turn of the hand, but the difference was that his father still moved, still struck. Regulus hadn't moved at all. He'd simply walked forward. Hermes didn't know who was stronger between Regulus and his father. The comparison was meaningless. The point was that Regulus was different from last semester. Back then, Regulus still relied on a shield charm and raised his hand for defense. Now he needed nothing. Hermes shook his head and forced the thought away. Other people's strength was their concern. His job was to make himself stronger. He sat by the wall for a moment to steady his breathing and recover, then picked up his wand and returned to the training area. The wooden dummies were still lined up. He drew his wand and set to work. Incantations rang out. Inside the small private room, Regulus sat cross-legged on the floor. There was nothing in there but 4 walls and a lamp floating in midair. Space magic, the branch he had the most room to grow in, occupied his focus. His disintegration curse had matured, fiendfire was almost within reach, and his natural magic still needed time to build. Space magic, however, held infinite possibilities. Space Sleep could already teleport the disintegration curse. He hadn't attempted teleporting fiendfire, too unstable, too dangerous, but everything else was feasible. Space Sleep, combined with Space Anchor and Apparition, could break through the weak anti-apparition charms like the ones in Reef Town. Those were mere dirt walls compared to what lay here. The anti-apparition wards in Hogwarts were like reinforced concrete. No simple trick would punch through. His Patronus, the starry sky kite, had developed a high-level function. The kite could travel through space in a way that actively parted the fabric of space itself. That was not something Regulus could do with his own body, but it was the Patronus's ability, and because it was his Patronus, he could call on it whenever he wished. He planned to test whether the starry sky kite could penetrate Hogwarts' barriers. If a phoenix could, the kite might too. He turned his thoughts to anchors. Since activating an anchor rune, his anchor capacity had jumped from 5 to 12. That didn't necessarily mean more was better. During the fight in Germany, one well-placed anchor had been enough to teleport a disintegration curse into a target's chest. But what if the anchors were connected instead of acting as isolated points? 12 anchors, each a fixed spatial channel. If he linked them into a web, he could do more. If a spell entering at point A could exit from any point B, C, or D, the result would be confusing enough. If the channels were made to move, the exit point could change while the spell was en route. If he himself didn't know where it would come out, the opponent would know even less. He could even preload spells into the channels, fire a few into the network and hold them there, then release them simultaneously. Single shots became volleys or barrages. This would be especially effective against opponents who relied on knowing the flow of space magic, and even more effective against legilimens. If even I don't know, what can you do? He thought. Regulus decided to test the idea. He activated his magic perception, feeling the spatial lattice of the room. The room of requirement itself had its own active magic, but the chamber's space was stable enough for his experiment. He performed a space leap to create the first channel and began placing anchors. One by one, 12 anchors, fixed and spread throughout the room, intangible but present. He closed his eyes and extended his magic, connecting 2 anchors at once so that they resonated like a bridge. A channel formed. He linked a third, then a fourth and a fifth. A simple network took shape. He opened his eyes, drew his wand, and cast a lumos toward the first anchor. The ball of light vanished. The next instant it reappeared at the third anchor, floating in midair. A corner of Regulus's mouth twitched. It worked. Next, he needed the network to act dynamically, to let a spell move inside the web on its own. He closed his eyes and adjusted the connections into a closed loop so that anything entering would circulate until he allowed it to exit. He cast another lumos. The light disappeared and kept circling. 1 second, 2, 3, still nothing. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. With a mental command, Regulus opened an exit, and the light emerged from the sixth anchor. It had dimmed slightly, but it still shone. He ran the numbers in his head. 10 seconds was enough to apparate to 3 positions, to let an opponent think the attack was over, long enough to unload 17 or 18 spells at once when the opponent relaxed. He tried a few more experiments. He stored an Expelliarmus and released it after 3 seconds. He stored an Impedimenta and released it after 5. He stored an Explosion Curse and released it after 8. Every trial succeeded. But the network exacted a cost. Maintaining it required constant magical focus and drained power quickly. The more spells stored, and the longer they were held, the faster the consumption. With all 12 anchors running, he could sustain the web for at most 30 seconds before it collapsed on its own. 30 seconds, he decided, was plenty in a real fight. This was only the beginning. He would refine it and grow stronger still. He withdrew his magic and let the network ebb away. The room went quiet again. He stood and considered what he'd done. From 5 anchors to 12, from isolated points to a connected network, from instant teleportation to delayed storage, from predictable exits to random circulating releases. Each step was small, but every step was forward. Space magic's path was long, and he was only getting started. The path of space magic was long, and the concept had enormous potential. But to use a spatial network in actual combat, there were still countless technical hurdles, chief among them, the math. Every spell stored in the network had a trajectory. If you stored several at once, you had to plan a route for each so they wouldn't collide. And collisions weren't a simple meeting of 2 spells. Different magical properties and differing spell strengths could trigger chain reactions on impact. A Stupefy colliding with an Expelliarmus might cancel out, but a healing charm colliding with a killing curse could wreck the entire network. It might not just collapse, it could disgorge every stored spell at once in every direction, a pure, indiscriminate explosion. Regulus had done the calculations. 1 spell meant a single free trajectory. It could go anywhere as long as it didn't hit a wall. With 2 spells, you had to offset them, Route A and Route B, so they never shared a node. With 3, you had to account for each pair's intersection points and make sure all 3 moved without interfering. With 5 spells meant 12 channels and exponentially more potential intersections. The complexity grew, not linearly, but by dozens or hundreds of times. Every additional spell doubled the computational load. He had to hold the movement trajectories of 5 independent spells in his head at once, constantly adjusting curvature, speed, and position, and predicting every possible intersection in the coming seconds to avoid them. That had been the real difficulty. His brain could crunch the numbers, but his mental control hadn't been able to keep up until he perfected star orbit meditation. With Wriggle lit, his entire consciousness had advanced a level. Calculating and controlling 5 trajectories at once was now manageable. More than that, however, still strained him. 10 or 20 spells would demand vastly more calculation and finer division of labor. The mental splitting technique could help. By dividing consciousness into several independent parts, each in its own little room, he could assign each a few trajectories. It was like running multiple threads at once. He had tried opening 3 consciousness windows to handle 15 trajectories and could barely keep them all running. He couldn't sustain that state, and one mistake would be catastrophic. So he had to proceed carefully and practice steadily. Regulus pushed open the door of the small practice room and returned to the larger training area, where he immediately found Hermes lying in the center of the floor, limbs splayed. If the man's chest weren't still rising and falling, he would have looked dead. Hermes' eyes were closed, his breathing ragged. Sweat plastered his hair to his face, his clothes soaked as if he'd been pulled from water. Regulus nudged his leg with the tip of his foot. "Get up." Hermes opened his eyes, glanced at him, shifted a little, then went still again. "Can't get up?" His eyelids twitched. Regulus tapped Hermes' right index finger with a light charm of levitation. He didn't completely levitate. The charm made his body lighter, letting him glide forward with only the faintest friction under his soles. Supported by that almost weightless force, Hermes slid forward with a little push from his toes and looked at Regulus, a trace of speechlessness in his eyes. Regulus ignored it, stepped through the doorway, and they headed back to the dormitory. One walking, one hovering. A quick wash, collapse onto a bed, and sleep. A few nights later, in mid-September, near midnight in the room of requirement, Regulus finally reached a milestone. The spatial network could store 5 spells at once in true, normalized operation. It wasn't merely about storage and release. The 5 spells moved through 12 channels, their trajectories crossing without interference. He could summon any one of them with a thought, or release them all at once. Standing in the center of the training area, he tapped his finger 5 times in quick succession. 5 Expelliarmus bolts shot into different anchor channels, traveled through the network for 10 seconds, then simultaneously burst from 5 separate nodes and flew off in different directions. The effect was spectacular and had real combat value. A 10-second delay, 5 simultaneous shots in random directions against someone ignorant of space magic that could be deadly. Leaving the room of requirement, Regulus walked toward the dormitory. At the corridor's end, a huge window framed the night sky. The full moon hung large and silver. Its light poured across the stone windowsill and picked out the grain of the frame. Regulus paused, looking at the moon, remembering something he had wanted to do last term, the Forbidden Forest. He'd planned to go, never found the chance. The opportunity had come now. He set off downstairs with a light step. 10 minutes later, he stood by the castle's main gates. The main entrance was the most direct way out, but also where Staff and Filch kept watch. He'd thought about slipping past the astronomy tower to avoid them. The castle's protective wards were dense now. Who knew if opening a door might trigger something? But as he neared the entrance hall, he saw 3 figures ahead, moving furtively toward the main gates. Regulus froze. In the dim light, their silhouettes were unmistakable. The one at the front strode with theatrical bravado, as if the world should know he was off on an adventure. James Potter. Half a step back hunched a small, shrinking figure who flinched at every rustle, Peter Pettigrew. Bringing up the rear, relaxed but watchful, glancing back now and then, Sirius Black. They were sneaking out of the castle on a full moon night. Lupin certainly wasn't in the dormitory tonight. James and Sirius claimed to keep no secrets from Lupin, but did they actually know what happened on the nights he vanished? Were they suspicious and had come to check? Or did they know and plan to accompany him? Either way, it was reckless. Dumbledore would have arranged protections if he allowed Lupin to attend school. There might be staff or wards watching the place of transformation. If James and Sirius simply followed, what if protections triggered? What if Lupin lost control and someone intervened? If an accident occurred, how would they handle it? With pranks? With a distraction? Acting on whims without forethought was stupid. Regulus at first resolved to take the side door and ignore them. Their business wasn't his. He glanced away. Then his fingers brushed the silver ring on his hand. The House of Black crest pressed into the face. His father had said, "Wear it, and if another Black is in mortal danger, the ring will heat." Regulus glanced at the band. It lay cold on his finger. Still, he made up his mind to follow. James and Peter might be fools, but Sirius, he tapped his hand against himself and cast an improved disillusionment charm. A cool sensation slid over him, and he vanished. He trailed them at a distance, but didn't need to be especially careful. The 3 were hardly alert. They left the castle, crossed the lawn, skirted the Black Lake, and crept toward the Whumping Willow. James swaggered at the head, turning back now and then to urge them to hurry. His whisper was too loud. Peter flinched with every rustle, darting glances around. Sirius brought up the rear, loose and confident but watchful. At the willow, its massive form rose under the moonlight, branches twitching like a giant sleeping creature. James crouched behind a clump of bushes and pointed to a spot at the tree's base, whispering instructions. Peter nodded eagerly, admiring. Sirius frowned, weighing it over. Then James bolted from the bushes for the trunk. The branches lashed out instantly and violently. James tried to force his way through, but the branches were too fast and dense. He dodged wildly, looking ridiculous. One branch cracked across his shoulder, another at his leg, nearly sending him down. Sirius moved to help, but the branches drove him back before he could get in range. He drew his wand and tried to aim a spell, but the willow gave him no clear opening. Peter cowered behind the bushes and trembled, unwilling to step forward. Regulus watched from the shadows and cataloged them. James Potter, bravery and initiative, but once his head's hot, he rushes in without thought, a perfect Gryffindor. Sirius, alert and capable, but hasty in action, also very Gryffindor. Peter Pettigrew, timid, a follower, utterly unreliable when things go wrong. Watching the trio's clumsy attempt, Regulus felt no sympathy. A faint amusement tugged at him. The humping willow was Dumbledore's first line of defense. Its attack pattern was fixed. Once you learned the rhythm, you could pass, but these three did not. They kept trying to force their way in. Then, Regulus' gaze halted. Another figure had materialized under an old oak beside the willow. A long silver beard gleamed in the moonlight. Half-moon spectacles caught the sky. He stood quietly, watching James and the others as if he had stepped out of the moonlight itself. Dumbledore. Regulus stared. His magic perception had been active the whole time, and yet he hadn't sensed anyone approach. Dumbledore had simply been there, as if he'd always been there, only now choosing to be seen. He watched James for a while, then turned his head. His gaze swept past the bushes, through the moonlight, and landed exactly on the spot where Regulus hid. He tilted his head and gestured toward a narrow path that lay outside the willow's attack range. Regulus understood. Dumbledore had intentionally let him be noticed, otherwise he would never have been found. Dumbledore might even have known Regulus would choose to follow. Knowing Sirius and the others might come, knowing Regulus wouldn't be sleeping, and knowing he might trail them, he'd been waiting. The old man's presence made Regulus feel the word unfathomable. He dispelled the disillusionment charm, stepped from his hiding place, and moved toward the small path Dumbledore had indicated. Behind him, James and the others were still tangled in the willow's branches, failing to notice that another person had appeared, and then another had slipped away. Regulus walked up to Dumbledore and waved his hand in front of the old man. Under the moonlight, a faint line of silvery numbers appeared, 1 to 17 a.m. He withdrew his hand and looked at Dumbledore. "Good evening, Professor Dumbledore." Dumbledore watched the numbers fade, his beard twitching upward. "Good evening, Regulus." His eyes blinked behind his spectacles. "It is indeed evening this time." The corner of Regulus's mouth lifted. The last time they had been up on the astronomy tower, it had been early morning. Regulus had said good evening, and Dumbledore had produced a pocket watch, checked it, and corrected him that, strictly speaking, it was morning. This time, Regulus had shown the hour first, and the old man had caught the reference. Dumbledore had a good memory. They both looked out toward the humping willow, which was still thrashing wildly. James had already rushed in, and Sirius had followed. Both were being pummeled inside. The cracking of branches carried clearly across the distance. James was making the loudest noise, howling. Whether from pain or from bravado, it was hard to tell. Sirius let out muffled grunts and an occasional expletive, but the willow's blows drowned them out. Peter was still huddled behind the bushes, trembling, unwilling to move forward. Regulus watched for a while. "Professor," he asked bluntly, "do you come here every month?" Dumbledore turned his head toward him. "Do you know what's inside?" Regulus nodded. "I know. A werewolf. Lupin." Dumbledore nodded too, not asking how he knew. The signs of lycanthropy were not easy to hide from a skilled witch or wizard. There were telltale changes in the magical aura, restlessness before the full moon, and that inhuman, hungry undercurrent in the magic. With Regulus's ability, it was natural he would notice. "On this night every month, yes," Dumbledore said. "Remus is a good boy. He should not be punished for what he is." He looked toward where James was still struggling. "What he needs more than anything is not to be condemned." Regulus listened. "The three of them," Dumbledore continued, "will learn something tonight. They may be frightened and withdraw, or they may make different choices." Regulus understood. Dumbledore was referring to what Sirius, James, and Peter would do once they discovered Lupin was a werewolf. Fear, retreat, or acceptance. Regulus had no doubt what they would choose. They would accept it, find a way to help, learn to be animagi, turn into animals to sit with him through the full moon. For friends, they would dare anything. He thought this, but did not speak it aloud. He also thought about Dumbledore's habit, setting a stage, letting young people face a hard truth, watching what they decide. Whether they caved or stood firm. whether they fled or protected. Then he would observe from the sidelines, guiding when necessary. If a result pleased him, he might offer praise. It was the pattern of an old teacher, watching people grow, liking to see who they became in a decisive moment. Regulus could understand that. He had felt the pull of reckless loyalty before, rushing forward for friendship, passion, and adventure over reason. But Regulus was more inclined to calculation. He weighed pros and cons, thinking things through before acting. Pure impulse was rare for him. He considered who among his acquaintances truly counted as friends. Lily, easy conversation, mutual understanding. Freya, the rare tacit understanding despite short acquaintance. Narcissa felt like family rather than friend. Avery, Alex, and Hermes were followers. Loyal, useful, but not companions for foolish, impulsive deeds. He fell silent. Dumbledore did not disturb him. He had noticed the look that sometimes crossed Regulus's face, something old beyond his years, and he had the patience to wait. After a while, Regulus spoke. "Friendship," he said, with a tone almost too sentimental for one so young. "When I think about it, it seems rare." Dumbledore looked surprised to hear it from Regulus, then laughed softly, amused and truly pleased. Regulus smiled a little. From inside the willow came a cheer. James and Sirius had finally leapt past the tree's effective range and crawled into the small entrance beneath the roots. Peter stood rooted in place, staring at the dark hole. He wanted to follow, but was whipped back every time he tried. He crouched behind the bushes, shaking. Regulus watched as Dumbledore raised a hand and gestured. The willow's branches slowed, their violence dimming to lazy swaying. Peter hesitated, then scrambled and crawled into the entrance. Dumbledore was nothing if not adept at arranging things. Regulus looked up at the moon, large, round, hanging in the center of the sky. He wouldn't be able to go into the Forbidden Forest tonight, but there would be other chances. "Shall we go in and take a look?" he asked. Dumbledore nodded. "Let's." Regulus drew his wand and cast a disillusionment charm, an improved version that masked light, heat, sound, and magical fluctuations, making him practically invisible. Dumbledore watched and complimented, "A very good disillusionment charm." Then, with a blink, the old man simply vanished. There was no fading, no distortion. He was just gone, as if removed from a photograph, leaving only the background. Regulus's magic perception had been active, but he could not detect anything where Dumbledore had stood. He turned his head, saw nothing, felt a twitch in the corner of his mouth. Dumbledore was showing off. The shrieking shack was in tatters. Furniture lay overturned, plaster peeled from the walls, splinters and rags strewn across the floor. Against one wall, a set of iron chains was bolted firmly to the stone, the other ends locked around a person, Remus Lupin. He knelt, hands and feet shackled tight, trembling. Sweat stood on his forehead, and his face was slate pale. James and the others crouched behind a broken bed. James peered out with wide, ready eyes. Sirius pressed him down, hand gripping his trouser seam, restraining himself. Peter was the farthest inside, only his wide eyes visible, darting about. Lupin's transformation began. Regulus's magic perception spread. He wanted to watch the process, the change of human to something else, how a wizard's magical aura was altered, how body and mind shifted. Lupin's magical aura stirred first. Under the familiar signature of a wizard, something caged and fierce fidgeted, like a beast pounding to escape. His body changed next. Bones creaked and lengthened, fingers bent and thickened, nails lengthened and darkened. His spine hunched, clothes shredded as his frame contorted, the face elongated into a muzzle, the mouth jutting forward, teeth sharpening. Lupin's wizarding aura was suppressed, and a different, primitive, animalic aura surged up, inhuman, driven by hunger and moonlight. That aura had no reason, only instinct, to bite, to rip, to destroy. Regulus perceived the pain in the change. The magical fluctuations told him Lupin's human mind was still there, struggling, resisting, as the beast bit away at his consciousness. It felt like standing at the edge of a collapsing cliff, unable to grasp anything as the ground gives way. The transformation finished. Where Remus had been stood a werewolf, tall on two legs, muscles coiled to spring. Gray-brown fur covered him. Hair grew into a mane. His maw was a ring of teeth, and his eyes were yellow, vacant of reason. He lunged and rattled against the chains, which clanked and held him back. He paced and howled, letting loose shrill, terrifying roars. James and Sirius breathed held air behind the bed. Regulus continued to study the creature's magical aura. The werewolf's aura was pure, reduced to base needs: hunger, escape, bite. The power had increased, the body becomes stronger, but Remus Lupin, as a conscious person, did not exist in that moment. What remained of him were tiny sparks of humanity, faint as a dying ember. Yet as long as those embers glowed, it was possible to turn back. The cruelty of the condition lay in that, not letting him fully become a beast permanently, instead only dragging his sanity through the blood and moon every month and leaving him aware of what he had been. Time crept by. The moon moved and began to wane. Slowly the beast's bloodthirst receded, the fur thinned, the teeth withdrew, the body shortened and softened. Lupin reverted to human form. He collapsed, drenched in sweat, clothes torn and marked by fresh scars. The iron chains held him, but he no longer had the strength to struggle. James was the first to scramble out. He rushed to Lupin, crouched at his side, reached a hand out, and then drew it back, uncertain where to touch. Sirius ran to stand nearby, panting. Peter lagged behind, peering from the shadows. Dumbledore patted Regulus on the shoulder and guided him out. They left the shrieking shack and stood again in the pale moonlight. The air felt cleaner. Regulus inhaled deeply and let it out slowly. Dumbledore looked toward the forbidden forest in the distance. "Regulus," he asked in an even, conversational tone, "what do you think of werewolves?" Regulus thought for a moment and then said simply, "They're too ugly." Dumbledore turned to look at him, his expression a little stiff, his beard twitching. He said nothing. Regulus didn't speak again. His mind was occupied by what he had just seen. Werewolves, or more precisely, lycanthropy. A magical disease, not a separate species, officially classified by the Ministry of Magic as something to be feared. It was extremely dangerous and impossible to domesticate. Its threat, however, came only on the night of the full moon. In human form, they were indistinguishable from ordinary people. Its origin was unclear. Some argued for Northern Europe, others for Western, but now it could be found everywhere. The mode of transmission was singular, being bitten by a werewolf in its wolf form during a full moon. Saliva had to enter the bloodstream. Scratches did not transmit the condition. Bill Weasley, after all, had been mauled by Greyback in human form and only developed a few wolfish preferences, an odd taste for raw meat among them, without fully turning into a werewolf. It wasn't hereditary either. Lupin's son, Teddy, was perfectly fine. It wasn't passed through blood or other fluids, and two werewolves could not produce a werewolf child. Regulus thought the mechanism was almost cruelly elegant. Just one bite. Bite and you either died if untreated, or you became a werewolf for life if treatment failed. There was no middle ground and no cure. Silver and wolfsbane were the only supposed remedies, and they had to be applied immediately after the bite. Any delay made them useless. A werewolf's danger lay in loss of control, contagiousness, and a magical resilience that would be formidable for an ordinary wizard. But one question kept returning to Regulus. What was a werewolf, really? A human who lost control one night a month, or a beast that regained its human mind one night a month? The question teetered between biology and philosophy. To call it human was to accept monthly bestial transformations. To call it beast was to accept monthly recoveries of humanity. In defining the werewolf, one ended up defining oneself. He let his thoughts wander. Theoretically, if the mind's floods during transformation were pure, primitive instinct, could something like occlumency be used to construct an isolation zone in the mind, to lock the instinct away so human thought could remain dominant in the body? Or could the human mind be placed inside with an observation window? During transformation, the werewolf would be a machine, and the person would sit in the cockpit, watching. He imagined Lupin changing into a wolf while his consciousness watched from within, aware, helpless as the body fought against unseen chains. The thought stirred his curiosity for a second before he pushed it down. It would be extraordinarily difficult, he knew, because he had tried similar things himself. He could build an isolation zone around the Dark Enlightenment's influence and interact with a virtual persona while watching from behind a mental glass. That was the limit of what he could do. Keeping primary consciousness awake during an eruption of instinct while simultaneously controlling the instinctive body would require coexistence in the mind, not merely isolation, several levels beyond occlumency. Then he thought of animag. The Lupin from 20 years in the future had said animagus change and lycanthropic transformation were fundamentally different, one voluntary, one forced, but both were, from a magical standpoint, shifts from human to animal. If a werewolf first learned to become an animagus, what would happen on a full moon? Would he shift into a wolf or into a werewolf version of his animagus animal? If someone's animagus form were a hamster, would he become a were-hamster, fist-sized, teeth bared, pouncing on anyone that passed? If an animagus were a jellyfish, would fangs sprout from a transparent floating body, each bite laced with venom? Regulus's mouth twitched. Part of him wanted to see it. His thoughts then turned to Fenrir Greyback, the most vicious of Voldemort's werewolves, given to biting children to create more monsters to oppose wizarding society. Lupin had been bitten by Greyback at 5. His life had been irrevocably altered. Regulus wasn't moved by pity so much as by the strategic possibilities. Why hadn't Voldemort used places beyond Britain, hot, densely populated regions with slums the Ministry couldn't manage? Take control of a township, unleash Greyback there on a full moon, let him bite everyone within reach. Even if he could only do 10 at a time, those 10 would become werewolves a month later and bite more. How many would there be in a year? The arithmetic of it fascinated him. He let the thought drift. Next to Dumbledore, he felt safe letting his mind go where it pleased. Dumbledore stood nearby, watching Regulus's profile. The boy had called the sight too ugly and then fallen silent, eyes fixed on the distant, shrieking shack, pupils unfocused with thought. Dumbledore said nothing. He was relieved in a way. This child was not as indifferent as he had seemed. He had been perturbed, seeing a peer become that would touch anyone. Dumbledore had no idea about the stranger mental pathways Regulus had traversed. If he had known about the were-hamsters and jellyfish with fangs, he might have been surprised, but he simply watched the 12-year-old standing on the edge of the forbidden forest, lost in thought. After a moment, Regulus drew his thoughts back. "Professor, I have a question." Dumbledore nodded, a gentle light in his eyes. "Go on." If one used occlumency to build an isolation zone in the mind, to lock away the instinct after a werewolf's transformation and let human consciousness dominate, would that be feasible? Dumbledore's gaze brightened. "Are you asking how to keep a werewolf sane during transformation?" Regulus nodded. "Yes, Professor." "Theoretically, perhaps," Dumbledore said. Occlumency can create positional stability for human consciousness within the mind, protecting it from external shocks. But there are two problems, he added. First, the essence of a werewolf's transformation is internal. The mind itself is changing, the body and cognition shift. It's not an external force knocking on the door. It is the house changing its rooms. Occlumency screens external intrusions, but it cannot prevent the self from becoming something else. Second, Dumbledore continued, even if human consciousness remains clear, the body will not obey. A werewolf's body has its own instincts and its own will. If your true self is trapped inside, you can watch, but you can do nothing. He looked steadily at Regulus. Your line of thought is correct, but realizing it requires something deeper than occlumency. It requires the wizard's will to override instinct, to let the consciousness take command of a body that does not want to be commanded. Dumbledore's gaze drifted beyond them. A wizard who could reach such a level would not then be a werewolf, and a werewolf, by the nature of the condition, cannot reach that level. Regulus turned the idea over in his mind, overriding instinct, taking over what is not yours. He thought of last year's experiments, a variation on the imperious-like control he had toyed with, not seizing control outright, but replacing. He considered the possibility and did not voice it. Dumbledore sighed softly. Very few in the werewolf community can master advanced mental techniques. Their living conditions are often wretched. Families abandon them, society ostracizes them, and they spend their days hiding. How could they find the peace to learn occlumency? Remus is fortunate, Dumbledore went on. His parents were willing to do anything for him, and I can protect him while he is at school. But not every child bitten at a young age is so lucky. Hearing this, Regulus realized something about Dumbledore's inclusiveness. It had limits. There must be many children carrying lycanthropy from a young age who never received acceptance or protection. Only Remus had been given the chance to attend school and learn. It wasn't that Dumbledore wouldn't help if he could. Regulus believed that, but he could not help everyone because many never reached him. Professor, Regulus asked, you said overriding instinct requires will and clear self-knowledge. What kind of foundation does that require? Dumbledore's eyes warmed with appreciation. You have touched on the key question. He continued, overriding instinct with will isn't merely about the raw strength of the mind. It's about how clear your self-perception is. You must know who you are, what you want, and what you are willing to sacrifice for it. The clearer these are, the stronger your will becomes. A wizard's exploration of the mental realm always returns to that question. Who are you? What kind of person do you want to be? He looked straight at Regulus. Do you have an answer? Regulus thought for a long moment. I know who I am, but I'm still working out who I can become. Dumbledore smiled. That is already very good. He glanced toward the forest where the moonlit trees swallowed the horizon. Many people go through life without ever knowing themselves. To be so sure at your age makes you stronger than many adults. Regulus nodded. After a pause, he asked, how does this, will overriding instinct and clear self-perception, relate to occlumency? Dumbledore turned back to him. Occlumency is a tool. It helps you build barriers and isolate yourself from external shocks, but it does not teach you who you are. The true mental work is using those tools to explore yourself. The better you understand who you are, the more stable your barriers become. And the more stable your barriers, the more clearly you can see yourself. It becomes a cycle. At first, you need tools to protect you. In time, you yourself become the barrier. Regulus considered this, seeing a deeper art of the mind Dumbledore was revealing. Becoming your own guardian. It meant that with a sufficiently clear and solid self, resisting outside harm would become natural. He thought of his own small breakthroughs, lighting up Rigel, the constant shield charm, and understood that his self was still being guarded rather than being the guardian. Perhaps one day his mental defenses would be like his shield. Always there, instinctive, so occlumency would be unnecessary except as practice. In the distance, 4 figures emerged from the shrieking shack. James and Sirius supported Lupin, walking slowly toward the castle. Lupin's head hung low, and his steps were unsteady, as if all strength had been drained from him. James and Sirius matched his pace, careful with each step. Peter Pettigrew followed behind, glancing around the grounds. Dawn was approaching. The eastern sky was paling to gray. The moon still hung in the west, but had faded. Dumbledore turned back to Regulus, a smile in his eyes. We'll go to the Forbidden Forest next time. After all, you'll probably sneak out again in the middle of the night. The corner of Regulus's mouth twitched. Good morning, Professor. Dumbledore returned the smile. Good morning, Regulus. Chapter 2-5, Illuminating the Soul. Over the next few days, Regulus attended classes as usual, spent time in the library in the restricted section, and visited the Room of Requirement. He did not rush back to the Forbidden Forest. The last time had been a strange impulse. Just a passing thought while looking at the moonlight, a sudden urge to go. That feeling had been odd, a thought that simply popped up and a desire to act on it. Then he had run into Sirius and his friends, met Dumbledore, and seen a werewolf transformation. He had mulled over random impressions and listened to Dumbledore speak of spirit and consciousness. He did not know whether it had been coincidence, intuition, or whim. The wizarding world held many things that could not be explained. Premonitions, intuition, a sixth sense, or, on a grander scale, prophecy. Some wizards were born with such gifts, others never encountered them. Regulus had never heard of any ancestor in the House of Black possessing this ability. These traits tended to run in bloodlines. If the ancestors did not have it, the descendants usually would not either. He put the thought aside. It had nothing to do with him. He would not pursue that feeling deliberately. Perhaps it was coincidence. Waiting cost nothing. If he had something, it might mean something. If not, so be it. The Forbidden Forest was there. He could go whenever he wanted. One afternoon in late September, in the library, Regulus sat in his usual spot, flipping through a book on Mental 33. Just as he reached a key passage, his peripheral vision caught a figure. Sirius was standing in front of a shelf, flipping through a book with frantic speed, pages rustling loudly. After several minutes, he shoved the book back, pulled another one out, and continued riffling. The noise carried across the room. Madame Pince rose from behind the counter, her hooked nose pointed, her gaze like knives. "Mr. Black!" she snapped. Startled, Sirius's hand trembled and the book nearly flew from his grasp. He turned, met Madame Pince's face, and froze for a moment. Then he forced a smile. Whether to placate her or provoke her, it was hard to tell, and tried to make his movements lighter. "If you do not want to read in the library, you can go outside," Madame Pince said. Sirius opened his mouth as if to answer, then closed it, slid the book back onto the shelf, and kept an eye on her until she moved away. Regulus looked away. He knew what Sirius was after, a way to accompany a werewolf through the full moon night. He already knew the answer, animagus, but no one had asked him, and he wouldn't volunteer the information. Friendship was something outsiders shouldn't meddle in. Let them work it out themselves. He recalled what he had told Sirius over the holidays about talent and paths. Try every kind of 33 you could. Observe where you progress fastest, which field felt most natural, and which you wanted to pursue. He did not know whether Sirius had taken his advice or found his direction. If Sirius discovered an aptitude for transfiguration and deliberately trained in that direction, would it shorten the time to become an animagus? In the original story, it had taken a year or two, maybe longer. Regulus wasn't sure. What mattered was Sirius was doing something productive. That was enough. He turned a page and continued reading. A Wednesday in late September, early morning, the room of requirement. Hermes lay sprawled on the floor again, limbs splayed, chest heaving, eyes half closed like a stranded fish. Beside him were a few fake 34 and some broken wooden mannequin arms and legs. If Hermes had been alone, he would not have trained himself to this point, but he knew Regulus was still in the small room inside. He trusted that when he finished and came out, Regulus would see him and use a levitation charm to lift him back to the dormitory. That thought let him train until exhaustion. Someone would take care of him. He might have to lie there a bit longer, but he felt safe. Regulus paid Hermes little attention. The boy's reliance on being picked up had made him bolder, training until he collapsed every time, then waiting like a pet to be carried away. Regulus said nothing. Willingness to train was a good thing, and it was no trouble to lift him up anyway. He sat in the inner room, thinking over what the 29s had said in recent days. Professor Slughorn had said that 33 is a partner, not a servant. Professor McGonagall had said that some things cannot be changed by transfiguration, positions, relationships, and points on the timeline. Dumbledore had said that will overrides instinct, and that self-awareness is the foundation of everything. Those words still felt distant. Regulus understood them intellectually and knew they were right, things of a higher level, but to turn them into practical power required time and a deeper grasp of 33. The 29s had pointed his direction, but he had to walk the path himself. Regulus could feel his present state, mental strength, willpower, physical resilience, and soul stability, all originating from star orbit meditation. With the rotation of the 5 stars, each cycle made him stronger. Slowly and steadily, he felt the progress. This improvement had been continuous since the day he lit Regel, but the things the 29 spoke of remained out of reach. Even so, he had to think about them. He pondered Dumbledore's words on mental defense and self-awareness. The guardian imagery of Regel had already merged into his constant shield charm. The charm was called constant because it was passive. It did not require deliberate mobilization of 33. He had maintained it for nearly a year. That 33 had become instinctual. He did not need to think about it. But mental defense, occlumency, was something he only cast when necessary. It was not always on. Keeping occlumency permanently active was possible, but it meant continuous consumption of 33 and mental energy. More importantly, it created a membrane between you and the world. Permanent occlumency dulled feeling and made connecting with others difficult. If you wrapped yourself too tightly, you could not touch anyone. Regulus did not feel he needed to touch anyone, at least not for the moment, but he did not want to be like that either. A different idea occurred to him. Rigel was protection, protecting me as me. Could that me itself become part of the barrier? If protecting the self and mental defense could be combined, If the me were made more stable, wouldn't that grant similar defensive effects without maintaining occlumency constantly? He began to try, but this was not a matter of days. Each meditation he returned to one central question in the star orbit: who am I? To Dumbledore he had said, I know who I am. Now, deeper in star orbit meditation, he probed further. Beneath the name Regulus Black, beneath the identity of heir to the House of Black, beneath all his learning and experience, what was the core that constituted me as me? What would never waver, no matter how the world changed, whether faced with Dumbledore's counsel, Lord Voldemort's offers, or Grindelwald's maneuvers? He needed to find it and make it clear enough to become the strongest barrier in the mental realm. The first day he saw nothing. The second day was still empty. On the third day, a blurry outline appeared. By the fourth day, it was a little clearer. He persisted through the fifth, sixth, and seventh days. In the deepest part of the star orbit, at the core of the mental world, he sensed, confirmed, and asked himself that question again and again. Finally, he saw it. At the center of the star orbit, where the light was brightest, stood a figure. It was very small, about the size of a thumb, standing there with no discernible front or back, just existing. Regulus looked and felt a strange swelling in his chest. That was him. Stripped of appearance, identity, and experience, stripped of everything external, this was the thing that made him who he was. The star orbit light flowed over the figure like water, wind, and time, but it did not move. It simply was. All 33, all willpower, all perception, all thought began there. Regulus knew what it was. Soul. He had seen his own soul for the first time. The process lasted an unknown duration. In the mental world, time had no meaning. It might have been an instant or a day. When he emerged from meditation and opened his eyes, the small room was the same. The light floating in the air, the four walls quiet. Regulus looked at his hands. They were unchanged, but he knew something had shifted. In the days that followed, he continued to practice, meditating every day and looking at that small figure, watching it become clearer and more stable at the star orbit's center. The light flowing over it brightened and purified. The progress was slow, but he was in no hurry. By the end of September, the change had become noticeable. His perception sharpened. Things that had once required concentration now came with a thought. Magic traces, the faint residue of spells, subtle activity in materials, even the emotional colors unintentionally revealed by other wizards, all became clear. Spatial perception improved. The room's boundaries, the thickness of the walls, tiny folds in the air, and even the spatial rhythm from the castle itself as it breathed. He could sense them all. His Patronus had grown stronger, brighter, more silvery white, more solid and agile than before. It now emerged from his chest almost of its own accord, darting nimbly within the small room. Each beat of its wings spilled starlight. It circled Regulus, flashing in and out, revealing an instinctive will to protect. Even the fiendfire had grown more obedient. When the orange-red flames swirled around him, they carried an odd intimacy, as if willing to be tamed. Regulus understood then. The progress from lighting Rigel had fully integrated only at this stage. Star orbit meditation had been running continuously, improving his 33, spirit, and willpower, strengthening him moment by moment. But it was only when that small figure appeared at the center of the orbit that those gains stabilized. The guardian star had not merely lit a corner of the star orbit, it had touched something deeper, the soul. Now the starlight of that star had merged into his system. With each rotation of the 5 stars, the cycle nourished that little figure. It had taken root at the center of the orbit, clearer and steadier than before. Now he could move to the next step, lighting Sirius. Regulus rose and pushed the door open. Outside, Hermes still lay on the floor. At the sight of him, Hermes' eyes fluttered, waiting. Regulus tapped his finger, a levitation charm, and the two drifted back toward the dormitory, one after the other. Back in the dormitory, Regulus casually tossed Hermes onto the bed and ignored him. After a quick wash, he lay down himself and let his consciousness sink inward. At the center of the revolving star orbit stood that figure again, small, luminous, a single point where all the light converged. Regulus stared at it, feeling something unfamiliar and quietly excited welling up inside him. Novelty. This thing was called a soul. He had heard countless theories about the soul. The dark arts could damage it, the killing curse could kill it, Cruciatus could rend it, Imperius could twist it. Almost every wizard could say a few things about souls. But what in truth was a soul? What shape did it take? How did it exist? How did it relate to the body? Few people truly knew. Regulus knew now. He looked at the glowing figure and thought of the wizards who stood at the pinnacle. Dumbledore certainly knew. In the original future, when Dumbledore's consciousness drifted near death after the poison, what had he seen? The books never described it, but Dumbledore later told Harry, "What I saw at King's Cross, Harry, I will not tell you." More importantly, when Harry was hit by the killing curse and arrived in that space between life and death, Dumbledore's soul was there to meet him and guide him. Dumbledore could not only see souls, he could retain a kind of consciousness after death and speak with the living. His understanding ran far deeper than most. Then there was Lord Voldemort. He was the only wizard known to have systematically observed, split, and manipulated his own soul. He mangled it through murder, sealed fragments into Horcruxes, and allowed himself to persist even if his body were destroyed. His examination was pathological. He could see the soul, but treated it strictly as a tool. A question occurred to Regulus. How did Voldemort divide his soul? Did he cut it limb by limb, leaving a shrunken head of a master soul, or peel it layer by layer until it could no longer form a human shape? Regulus looked at his own intact little soul figure and wondered whether Voldemort's had become mangled and gray, missing pieces. He'd never split a soul, and those who had wouldn't advertise the fact. If he ever had the chance, Regulus thought he would like to see it with his own eyes, not only out of curiosity, but to know what a soul becomes after such torment. Voldemort, of course, would never let him. Dumbledore and Voldemort were the era's two greats. It made sense they had profound but different relationships to the soul. Dumbledore turned inward to see essence. Voldemort used the soul outwardly as an instrument. Grindelwald, Regulus suspected, was another kind of observer. Given his overwhelming will and mastery over the mind, it would be strange if he could not perceive his own soul. All three could see it, but each had different focus and use. Dumbledore inward, Voldemort outward, Grindelwald free to look and use as he pleased. Regulus drew his thoughts back to himself. What did it mean that he could see his soul now? Was this good or bad? The little soul still had room to grow. He had no doubt he would develop toward their level, and that one day he would naturally be able to see souls. But it felt early. He was only 12, a second year. Yet the whole process had felt natural when it happened. Star orbit meditation, the motion of the 5 stars, the protection lit by Rigel, and then, at the deepest part of his mental world, asking himself over and over, who am I? After asking and asking, he saw it. There had been no external force, no accident, nothing dark mixed in. Every step had been his own. So it was probably not a bad thing. He thought again about Voldemort. Voldemort had been able to split his soul by his 5th year, while Regulus could only see his. That comparison made his achievement seem small. He didn't know if there was any necessary link between being able to see a soul and being able to split one. He set the question aside. Regulus considered the changes he felt. His self-knowledge had become firmer, a confirmation from the inside out. He didn't just know who he saw who he was. That might mean his magic perception had advanced beyond the material level. An ordinary wizard's perception remained at the level of magical fluctuations, spell structures, and enchanted objects. Regulus's ability to see the soul suggested his perception had entered the conceptual, from perceiving magical energy to perceiving existence itself. There was also an absolute confirmation of self. Seeing the soul was seeing the immutable me. From now on, any force attempting to change his essence, be it the erosion of dark enlightenment, cognitive attacks, or tampering at the soul level, would struggle to bypass his soul defense. Because he could now see the core that needed protection, he had a natural defense against soul-level assaults. Knowing what a soul should look like let him detect alterations immediately. This was more advanced than traditional occlumency. Occlumency defended against intrusion into consciousness. Observing the soul defended against alteration of existence itself. The sensation was like lighting a lamp at the heart of his mental world. Everything that came in had to pass through that lamp's light. Disguises had nowhere to hide, and changes could not begin. Rugal had lit the protection of his self-boundary. Seeing the soul felt like an extension of that. Rigel protected the boundary. Seeing the soul revealed the core within it. If Rigel told him who he was, seeing the soul showed where that me was located. Together, the defenses were no longer a simple barrier, but an absolute confirmation founded on direct cognition of the self's essence. He stopped thinking about the soul and turned to the next star, Sirius, the sixth star in his Orion pattern. Astronomical facts rose in his mind. Positioned at the lower right of Orion, forming a large quadrilateral with Betelgeuse and Rigel, its Arabic name meant Sword of the Giant. It lay 650 light-years away, weighed 15 or 16 times the sun, and its surface temperature reached 26,000 degrees. Most of its energy radiated in the ultraviolet, invisible to the eye, so it looked dim even though its actual luminosity was great. Eventually, it would end its life in a supernova, an invisible edge, a destination fated for explosion. He analyzed the symbolism. If Betelgeuse was a fist and Rigel a shield, then Sirius should be a sword. A fist swings, a shield raises, but a sword usually sits in its scabbard, unshowy, but everyone knows it's there. When drawn, it decides the outcome. The image was clear. What would trigger the lighting of Sirius? Perhaps it required the first decisive action to influence the outside world, rather than merely responding. Perhaps it meant seeing through things others could not, and achieving a goal because of that insight. Perhaps it required accepting that an edge brings destruction, and still choosing to use it. Perhaps the soul figure must grasp it, starlight condensing into a blade in the figure's hand, rather than merely nourishing the figure. He looked up at the starry layout in his mind. The 5 stars revolved, their orbits fixed and clear. He began to build a model to place Sirius within. Normally, this would demand lengthy calculations, orbital parameters, gravitational interactions, the balance of magical energy flows. Each step would need adjustments. This time, though, the data surfaced on their own, as if the stars themselves whispered where they belonged. Betelgeuse's explosion, Rigel's protection, Orion's belt order, they all seemed to tell him where Sirius should sit. He tried to tweak the position, but there was nothing to change. It was already right. He slipped the model of Sirius into place, and the 6 stars moved of their own accord. Orbits adjusted, distances fine-tuned, flows harmonized. The whole process took less than 10 minutes and a new balance formed. The 6 stars settled into their places, and Sirius lit. It was faint, barely a pinprick of light, but it was genuinely shining, linked to the other 5 to make a new whole, 5.5 stars. Regulus looked for the symbolic image of Sirius, but found none. It did not merge into offensive spells like Betelgeuse, nor did it fold into protection like Rigel. Sirius simply shone, a supplement to the star orbit meditation itself. The whole system was more stable, the magic flow smoother, and his perception keener, but the star's imagery remained elusive. Perhaps it related to its invisible edge, or perhaps it required some action or experience to awaken fully, like a ritual. For now it was only dimly lit, integrated into the system, but not yet truly active. He glanced once more at the figure at the center of the orbits. It stood there, illuminated as the 6 stars' light passed through it. Regulus withdrew from the mental world. The 5.5 stars revolved quietly in the depths of his consciousness. Time to sleep. Chapter 207, Accusing Sirius. On the last day of September, the sky was a flat gray, the clouds hanging low. A light drizzle came and went, dappling the stone of the castle walls with dark streaks. It was Professor Binns's History of Magic lesson. He floated behind the podium and droned on about the giant wars, picking up where he'd left off, mopping up the last hostilities, the rout and flight of the giants, and their final expulsion to the remotest ranges of Europe. Regulus sat in his usual place, his thoughts drifting further and further away until the bell finally rang, and a collective sigh of relief filled the classroom. At noon, Regulus and the others filed into the great hall for lunch. The long tables were piled high, roast beef, Yorkshire puddings, roast potatoes, carrot sticks, and a large pitcher of pumpkin juice. The house elves' work was as reliable as ever. Avery and Alex sat together, talking in low, excited voices. "Have you seen this year's new lot?" Avery said, prodding a potato with his fork. "That knot looks fierce." Alex's mouth was full of pudding. "And the Flint boy, he's enormous." What's the use of being tall? Avery put on an air of seniority. We were new once, too. Look at Regulus. He glanced toward Regulus as if by habit and dropped his voice a little more. Regulus heard him but paid it no mind. He had been smaller his first year, that was true. Avery was talking about tonight, the Slytherin welcome and the contest to be first-year head. This time last year, Regulus had stood among the new students, making himself remembered with a shield charm. Hermes had been unconvinced and answered with bone and blood stripping, only to find himself pinned to the ground. Looking back, it seemed like a very long time ago. Avery kept critiquing the new arrivals. That Knott's brood looks gloomy, must have some skill. Flint's big, but I reckon he'll be clumsy and won't last 2 rounds. And that one, what's his name, from the Selwyns? Is it a girl or a boy? A girl, Alex said. Rosalie Selwyn. Right, Rosalie. Avery nodded as if mapping the lay of the land. Selwyns are not to be messed with, but they're still first years. No matter how tough, they're new. Remember Hermes last year? Looked impressive until... Alex nodded, wearing that expression of having truly been taught a lesson. Hermes, sitting not far away, felt the twitch at the corner of his mouth. He remembered last year well. He'd picked up a few dark arts tricks at home and thought himself formidable until Regulus showed him how big the gap really was. The thought made him wince, like reading some foolish thing you'd written as a child and wishing you could erase it. He went on eating in gloomy silence. Regulus listened, but his mind was elsewhere. The first-year head contest was, on the surface, merely ritual, an opportunity for the new students to show themselves. Slytherin prized power. That lesson was taught from childhood. Establishing one's place in the first year mattered for the years to come. A status won by combat felt more secure than one handed down by ancestry or connections. Yet it also had downsides. Winning a couple of bouts could swell a student's head. Hermes had been like that, and last year had humbled him. The rule was simple enough. If you want to stand high, you must prove you deserve it. Regulus had no strong feelings about the contest, but he had to show up tonight. He didn't need to fight, just being present was enough. He could occupy the fringes of Slytherin, and no one would dare question him to his face. That was the point of early established status. Still, some occasions required attendance as a mark of respect for the collective rules. After lunch, he set down his knife and fork and stood. Hermes had finished long ago and rose at once. Avery and Alex rose too. Avery, however, wasn't in a hurry to leave. He called over a couple of first-years who'd been leaning in at the table. Avery clapped one on the shoulder and lowered his voice with advice. Don't be too nervous in the first round. Keep steady. You know impedimenta, right? If you don't, then keep moving. Don't try to bring someone down straight away. Watch your opponent first. Last year, someone was too keen to show off and didn't even make it past round 1. The boy nodded eagerly, full of awe. Nearby, a different small first-year in Slytherin robes was whispering with Alex. Alex comforted him. Hermes kept to himself, his face set and forbidding. The younger students gave him a wide berth. Avery finished his pep talk, patted the boy again, and said, "See you tonight." The 4 older boys walked out together, the 2 first-years watching their backs in admiration. "That one is," one whispered. The other nodded, eyes shining. As they crossed the hall, someone called, "Regulus!" The voice came from the Hufflepuff table. He turned and saw Eleanor Bones standing, Susan Payne beside her fumbling at her robe. Eleanor had gotten up and strode over. Regulus had a passing familiarity with Eleanor. In first year, they'd bumped into each other in a small garden and chatted about herbology. She'd been loosening soil while he was examining some magical daisies. On Halloween, she'd asked him to transfigure a pumpkin into a badger-faced lantern. Last semester, when he had been taken hostage by a dark wizard, she had come over to the Slytherin table to see if he was all right. They hadn't spoken a lot, but her warm, straightforward manner had made her a pleasant acquaintance, someone he might well become friends with. Eleanor wore Hufflepuff robes with the yellow trim. Her light brown hair was twisted into a loose bun with a few strands escaping at her ears. She walked up in an almost assertive way, but as she reached him, she winked. Regulus felt, without turning, a gaze from the Gryffindor table. Sirius. His heart gave a little stir. He guessed what was coming. Avery and the others were about to move on, thinking Eleanor had something to discuss with Regulus, but she waved them off. "Casbert, no need to leave," she called. Avery froze. Alex and Hermes halted. Eleanor planted her hands on her hips and, half complaining, half grumbling, said directly, "Regulus, you have to control your brother." Regulus raised an eyebrow. Eleanor continued, indignant. "I've been tending a mandrake in the greenhouses for over half a year. It was nearly mature, and do you know what he did? He tore off every single leaf. I asked him what he'd done with them, and he told me not to meddle in his business." She glanced at him as if to ask, incredulous, "How can two blacks be so different?" Avery's mouth twitched. No one liked mentioning Sirius in front of Regulus. When they first arrived at Hogwarts, they had all assumed the blacks were a certain sort. After all, one had become a traitor. But Regulus's steady competence had made them mentally exclude Sirius from the family reputation. The two brothers were simply in a different league. Mentioning Sirius now was unnecessary. Eleanor didn't expect any real action from Regulus. "I'm not asking you to do anything," she said. "The leaves are gone. What's done is done. I just wanted to tell you." Then, with an amused flick to the Gryffindor table, she added, "And make that person feel uncomfortable." She glanced deliberately toward the Gryffindors, essentially announcing, "I'm tattling to your brother." Regulus found the move clever in a petty, Hufflepuff way. Not to attack directly, but to use what she knew of family relations as a kind of revenge. He allowed himself the barest smile and a small nod. Across the hall, Sirius's expression soured. James looked ready to leap up, but was held back by Lupin. Lupin had his hand on James's arm and sent an apologetic look over. Regulus let his gaze slide away, a faint smile still at the corner of his mouth. Eleanor laughed as she turned to leave and clapped Regulus on the shoulder. "Thanks, Regulus. Seeing his face made my day." Her steps were lighter as she went back to the Hufflepuff table. Chapter 208. Something's Wrong. Call for the Professor. Near the end of dinner, two students rose from the far end of the Slytherin long table. Pollux Greengrass, the new male prefect, tapped his goblet lightly with a silver spoon. The sound was crisp and the chatter cut off. No one spoke. They all knew what was coming. "All Slytherin students, please return directly to the common room after dinner." His gaze swept the room, lingering on the first-year section. A few first years immediately straightened under his look. Veronica Yaxley, the new female prefect, stood opposite him and spoke after he finished. "First years, you must attend. This is a Slytherin tradition." She stood ramrod straight, the silver-green prefect badge catching the candlelight. Low murmurs rippled down the long table. A few sixth years exchanged looks. There was less of the amused snickering that had accompanied last year's spectacle, and a little more anticipation. One boy lowered his voice. "I wonder if anyone like Black will show up this year." The student beside him scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. It takes a blessing from Merlin to get one of those in a decade." "Blessing who? Black or—" The remark trailed off as his companion tugged at his sleeve. "I heard Greengrass and Yaxley are strict. I wonder if the procedures changed." "How much can they change? It's just dueling." A seventh-year girl pursed her lips and nodded toward the second-year area. "Honestly, I just want to see the look on the first year's faces when they realize they have to measure themselves against last year's champion." Several heads turned. Regulus sat in the second-year area, idly prodding the last piece of roasted potato with his fork. His reputation had grown enormous. Last year's duel, originally a private Slytherin matter, had spread throughout the school. Some said he defeated his opponent in a single move. Others claimed the feat bordered on the impossible. Whatever the details, everyone agreed on one thing. No one in Slytherin dared challenge him now. People stopped speaking loudly in his presence. They made way without question. It wasn't fear exactly. It was an unspoken acceptance of the center of gravity he represented. The first years reacted more directly. Those from the core pureblood families stood rigid, faces full of nervous eagerness. This was their chance to show themselves. The half-bloods and those from less prominent lines blended into themselves, eyes flicking the way a hunted animal searches for cover. Inevitably, those anxious glances found the second years. Regulus finished his last bite, set down his knife and fork, and stood. Almost instantly, the other second years rose too. It wasn't the usual etiquette. People typically left when they were done, But today, the freshmen were watching, and Slytherin pride insisted on a visible center. The movement drew more eyes. A few upperclassmen shrugged and stood as well. Some lagged a beat behind. The common room hummed with expectation. The emerald green fireplace warmed the lounge, dark green curtains with silver-threaded patterns catching the firelight. Upperclassmen gathered on sofas, speaking in low voices. The freshmen came in, clustering at first, then breaking into small groups. Purebloods edged to the front, the others drifted to the back. Regulus took a seat on an empty sofa. Avery sat to his left, Alex to his right, and Hermes leaned on a nearby couch, silent. Regulus folded his hands over his stomach and watched the first years. Pollux walked to the fireplace, scanned the room, and the lounge fell silent. Veronica stood slightly behind him, serious. Pollux spoke in a controlled, flat voice. "Welcome to the Slytherin welcoming ceremony. The tradition is simple. First years duel in pairs. The rules. First, there are no spell restrictions, as long as you can cast it without sending someone to Madame Pomfrey. Second, the goal is for you to learn yourselves and your peers. Slytherin respects strength and respects even more the wisdom to control it. Victory or defeat will be determined by the prefects." Veronica held up a silver cup filled with folded parchment slips. "Draw lots to decide your opponents." The first years stepped forward, drawing from the cup one by one. Some opened the slip and breathed a visible sigh of relief. Others' hands shook so badly the paper nearly slipped away. A few drained to pale when they saw they had drawn a knot. The girl who drew a Selwyn frowned as if disappointed with the match. When the last paper had been taken, the common room pulsed with tension. The relieved were already gauging their opponents. The nervous kept trembling. The cornered had already begun to shrink inward. Upperclassmen started to trade bets. A sixth year produced a small notebook. "Betting's open. Who's winning this year? 5 galleons on that knot." A nearby girl snorted. "No way. I'm putting mine on the Selwyn girl. She looks steady." Someone else. "What about the Flint? He's huge." Another. "What's big got to do with it? If size mattered, you'd marry a troll." One boy coughed. "With Black's show last year, the pressure on these lot is massive." He nodded toward the freshmen. "Look how they're all watching the second years." It was true. The first years found their way back to their places, but kept glancing at Regulus. Some dared only one quick look. Others peered repeatedly. Regulus sat motionless. Pollux raised his hand. "Begin." The first pairing took the ring, a flurry against a distant Macmillan, ordinary purebloods with little family renown. Flurry fired first. "Impedimenta!" A purple light shot out. Macmillan dodged and replied with the leglocker curse. Flurry's legs snapped together, and he toppled backward. As Macmillan prepared to gloat, Flurry mumbled as he fell, "Stupefy!" A red bolt shot up, striking Macmillan square in the chest. He collapsed on top of Flurry in a tangled heap. Laughter broke out, and the prefects called it a draw. The next match, 2 girls. One hurled a jinx, the other countered with Tarantellegra. One was left laughing uncontrollably, the other dancing wildly. They collapsed, panting and glaring. A draw. Third match, a tall, thin boy against a short, heavy-set one. Repelling charm and impedimenta clashed for a long stretch with no decisive hit. Then the thin boy shifted tactic and used a silent spell. The short boy, about to speak his incantation, found he could no longer make a sound. His lips moved, but no words came out. Stunned, face flushed, he froze. The thin boy seized the moment with a stupefy and won. Applause from the upperclassmen. "That trick's clever," someone said. "Whose is it?" "Never heard of it." Regulus followed the duels with his eyes, but his mind was partly elsewhere. He was already planning the room of requirement that night. The spatial network and the 5 spells running simultaneously had stabilized. It was time to add more. After integrating Sirius, his mental endurance had improved. 1 or 2 more integrations shouldn't be a problem. A freshman Regulus had barely noticed stepped into the circle next. Thin, plain, robes slightly off, he looked as nervous and excited as the others. Regulus considered looking away, but paused. There was something wrong with that boy's magic. Agitated, burning, surging like a desperate thing trying to get out. It wasn't merely strong, it was eruptive. Regulus raised an eyebrow. He didn't deliberately cast out his magic perception. With his current level, it clung to whatever his eyes rested on. He kept his voice low and spoke to Alex. Only Alex could hear. "Find Professor Slughorn. Say something happened in the common room. Alex blinked, confused for a fraction of a second, then nodded. He had been with Regulus for a year and knew better than to ask. He leaned back, expression unchanged. Behind him, Samuel Vance and Lena Costa, two half-blood second years who tended naturally to gravitate toward Regulus, shifted a little nearer. They didn't sit, they stood, acknowledging their place at his side. Alex whispered to Lena. She didn't hesitate. She nodded and slipped quietly out from behind the group. Her steps were light, and the circle's attention was fixed on the dueling ring, so no one noticed. Samuel hesitated, glanced at Regulus's back, then followed. Regulus kept watching the circle. The thin boy had made his move. Flipendo. A red bolt shot from the tip of the boy's wand, faster and brighter than usual. His opponent couldn't dodge, slammed into the wall, and crumpled. Gasps ran through the room. A few upperclassmen exchanged looks and whistled. Decent spell, strong force. Who's that? Never heard of it. The boy stood panting, excitement all over his face. Regulus watched the boy's magic after the spell had been cast. The agitation was still there. If anything, it had grown more chaotic, like a blaze spreading to things inside that should not burn. Regulus leaned back against the sofa. Avery bent over and whispered, "What's wrong?" He'd seen Alex slip away. Regulus only shook his head slightly. Avery didn't press. He watched the excited first year in the ring, then looked at Regulus with a thoughtful expression. Alex's face was serious but silent. In the ring, the boy stood waiting for another opponent. No one noticed that two second-year half-bloods had silently slipped out of the common room. "Stop for a second. I told you to stop." Lena skidded into the corner of the corridor, came to a halt, looked back, and waited until Samuel caught up from behind. Her tone wasn't friendly. "I thought you wouldn't come." Samuel didn't answer right away. The hesitation he'd shown in the lounge a little while ago was gone. His expression was cool, almost unreadable. "It's better if we act differently," he said. Lena raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "In front of Black," Samuel said. "If you always jump at his orders and follow them without thinking, then I should be the one to hesitate. Whether it helps or not, he'll notice a difference between us. Later on, when there are other things to decide, we'll present two different choices." Lena stared at him for a moment, and the logic sank in. They were similar people, half-bloods, Slytherins, usually pushed to the margins in this house. Pure-blood families treated them with thinly veiled contempt. Why are you here? In their second year, they had been a weak little cluster that could only huddle together. But huddling wasn't enough. They had to climb. Toward Alex, toward that small circle, toward Black. They couldn't step up directly yet, but they could linger on the periphery, be visible when needed, and prove their usefulness. Survival required that kind of calculation. Lena knew it. Samuel knew it. "You were like that last time, too," she sniffed. Samuel's frown tightened. "I told you, don't ever mention what happened last time again. Not even between the two of us." Lena shut her mouth. Last time really shouldn't be brought up. The memory still smarted. The Gryffindor bastards who had cornered them, disarmed them with 3 simultaneous Expelliar Muses, and locked them in an abandoned lavatory. Humiliating then, but it had also been an opportunity. They'd gone to Alex and asked for help, not because they wanted him to fight their battles, but because they wanted Alex to know and to make sure Black did too. They needed any reason to appear in Black's sightline. Being victims had been that reason. Black had learned of the incident and let Alex handle it. To Black, it might have been a trivial matter. He might even have forgotten it. To them, it was the first time they had deliberately made themselves visible, and it had worked. Since then, they shadowed Alex, never in front, but always close enough to be noticed when necessary. Lena forced down the memory and gave orders. "Fine, I won't mention it. You go to the material processing room. I'll go to the office." Samuel nodded. "Come back quickly once you find it." They exchanged a look and ran off in different directions. Lena ran hard. The corridor was empty, and her footsteps echoed. All she needed to do was deliver Black's instruction through Alex, find Professor Slughorn, and tell him there's something happening in the lounge. One sentence. No explanations, no reasons. It was enough. She didn't need to understand why, only to do it well. In Slytherin, that was the difference between being seen and being nothing. When she reached the lounge, the air was already charged. Two students stood in the center, Rosalie Selwyn and Darius Knott. Regulus lounged on a sofa, watching. Upper years clustered in small knots, some holding goblets, some leaning against the sofas, all eyes fixed on the duelists. A sixth-year Selwyn, Rosalie's cousin, sat amid the older students, twirling a goblet and watching with a thin smile. The Knott boy's jaw was dark. The Knott family was respected among pure-blood lines, but Darius himself looked tense rather than poised. For a moment they circled each other. Then Darius struck first. Stupefy! A red bolt shot from his wand, quick and angled to catch Rosalie off balance. She ducked neatly and fired back. Impedimenta! The purple charm hit Darius and froze him for a breath. He shook it off, stepped out of its arc, altered his angle, and sent another curse. Leg locker curse! Rosalie vaulted out of reach, and the moment she landed, began to chant again. Jinx! The counter came out clean and precise. Darius's face tightened. The corners of his mouth trembled as if he wanted to laugh. Instead, he forced out a spell. Tarantallegra! Rosalie's legs jerked into uncontrollable dancing. She spun and hopped to the rhythm, dodging between attacks while keeping her eyes fixed on him. Darius wasted no time and sent Stupefy again, but she danced clear of it. Her movements looked chaotic, but every step was a calculated dodge. Then, abruptly, she planted her feet as if the entire performance had been an act and pointed her wand. Expelliarmus! The red jet struck Darius in the chest. His wand flew from his hand, twirled twice, clattered to the floor, and rolled to the edge of the crowd. He stood there stunned, staring at empty air, then bowed his head and conceded. The lounge erupted in cheers and whistles. That Selwyn girl's steady. I knew she didn't actually get hit. The Knott boy's no good. He didn't even notice his spell failed. Regulus watched, disinterested. Darius bore the same gloomy temperament as last year's Hermes, quiet, hard to provoke, but Hermes would have been sharper, more dangerous when he first arrived. This Knott wasn't impressive. Rosalie, however, had something to her. No theatrics when chanting, efficient footwork, an instinct for when to feint and when to finish. Tactical awareness at that age was uncommon. Still, the duel felt tame to Regulus. Compared to the battles he had faced in Germany, a disintegration curse here, fiendfire there, space-leaping maneuvers, this was child's play. He leaned back and tapped his fingers idly against his knee. Pollux Greengrass strolled to the center and raised a hand. Rosalie Selwyn wins. The sixth-year Selwyn stood, raised his goblet, and offered a polite, restrained smile as others congratulated him. Your family can be proud this year, someone said. She's steady. She'll go far. They clinked glasses. The cousin's gaze lingered approvingly on Rosalie. Veronica Yaxley took the match list and announced the next pair. Next, Jeffrey Saller versus Rosalie Selwyn. A ripple of murmurs. Saller? Who's that? The one who used that strong repelling charm earlier? Might be a good match against Selwyn. Some began to place bets. 1 galleon for Selwyn, 2 on Saller. Conversations drifted to last year. Not as good as last year's lot, someone said. Mulciber looked powerful, but Black cut him down with a single shield charm. And Travers, pathetic. Rosalie and Jeffrey faced one another. She was composed, wand held at her side. Jeffrey looked down at his toes, drawing absent circles on the floor with his heels, nervous, small, unimposing. Regulus noted the boy's background, likely from a minor old family, a quiet lineage. But the magical energy under the boy's skin pulsed with something more noticeable than most new students. They both raised their wands. Stop! The single word cut through the room. Conversations died. Rosalie froze. Her wand halted mid-arc. Jeffrey blinked up, startled. Pollux turned with a frown. Mr. Black, what is it? Regulus didn't answer directly. He leaned back on the sofa, hands folded over his stomach, meeting Pollux's eyes evenly. Mr. Greengrass, he said, once there's a winner, what happens next? Any other arrangements? Pollux blinked. Yes, the winning freshman can choose whether to challenge the previous prefect, he said. It's not compulsory, just an opportunity to receive guidance. Regulus nodded. He had expected as much. Pollux and Veronica were new prefects and had added this segment to the welcome party. Regulus spread his perception outward, letting it sweep the room lightly, taking everything in as if measuring not only the magic in the air, but the potential of the choices about to be made. Chapter 210, You Have Met the Right Way to Die. Pollux Greengrass's magic was steady, calm, controlled, without malice, just like the man himself. Veronica Yaxley's was a little sharper, but equally unthreatening. Regulus could tell the new duel segment the two of them had devised was not aimed at him. That left only one possibility. Someone else knew about the new segment, had approached Jeffrey outside school, incited him, given him something, and pushed him to show off today, win a few matches, and finally challenge Regulus. Jeffrey had clearly been manipulated. For a minor family that couldn't even scratch the surface of the great pureblood houses, the options were simple: live quietly or climb desperately. Whether the Sayers had planned this or Jeffrey had been led into it himself didn't matter now. The magic in his body was already on the verge of spiraling out of control. If Regulus hadn't noticed, Jeffrey would have accepted the challenge. Of course he wouldn't have refused. A first-year prefect challenging the previous one was an event of deep tradition. Guidance, honor, and public face were all involved. Given Regulus's level, even the strength he usually showed at school, Jeffrey would have had to go all out. Whether he meant to learn, to make a name for himself, or to defeat Regulus for fame, he would have had to use everything he had. And then Jeffrey would suffer an accident in front of everyone, fainting, crippling injury, magic gone awry, or perhaps being frozen forever at a first-year standard, no better than a squib. Or worse. Whoever designed this had chosen the timing and the pawn well. A malleable first year from a small family, easy to incite, and expendable if things went wrong. Only a few could have known about the new segment: the prefects, those who helped prepare it, and anyone who'd asked about the plans beforehand. But Regulus did not need to guess or gather proof. That malice was here in the common room, and it smelled the same as when Arnold Belmont had leapt out before: cold, cruel, and stained with the scent of blood. Dolphin Rowe, 7th year and eldest son of the Rowe family, lingered in the shadows. Normally low-key and unobtrusive, he preferred corners at gatherings and the edges at meals. Sometimes people forgot he existed. But everyone knew what kind of man Dolphin Rowe was and what the Rowe family could do. Now he stood with his hands in his robe pockets, posture lazy, the barest smile on his lips. He watched Regulus with keen interest and never once looked at Jeffrey, the pale, desperate boy standing at the center, who was about to be cast as the play's tragic prop. To Rowe, the Sayers were not even a tool, merely a prop, used up, broken, discarded. What did that matter to him? Regulus caught Rowe's eye and nodded slightly, lifting his wineglass in a casual gesture. That thin malice, though, landed fully on Regulus like a stone. Rowe had targeted him again. The first time had been with Belmont, the second was now. Each time Regulus could only confirm Rowe's involvement by sensing the malice. Rowe never showed his face, never acted openly, never left evidence. Compared with Belmont's brazen interference that had forced Regulus to take a public stance and resulted in public humiliation and family ruin, this was subtler and far more dangerous. Belmont had been risky. He could be exposed and retaliated against. Rowe's way left no trace. Jeffrey Sayer was perfect for the job, ignorant of the consequences, easily persuaded with a few words and something to drink, told what he could gain, and he would believe. If anyone attempted a real investigation, the trail would likely end with Jeffrey. Maybe his memories were empty or overwritten. The real instigator would be untraceable. If Regulus accepted the duel, Jeffrey would almost certainly have an accident. But what did this have to do with Dolphin Rowe? Rowe hadn't lifted a finger. He'd simply watched. Outside school, Rowe would have been an obvious target. No trial needed. Just the malice present would be cause enough. You dare to harbor this level of malice toward me, dare to appear before me, and even dare to put it into action, Regulus thought. You have sought your own death. All Regulus needed was discovery, confirmation, and memory. Then Rowe could be made to disappear quietly. No trial, no conviction, no one the wiser. Just a day, a moment, a hidden corner. But this was Hogwarts. Dumbledore, professors, and 1,000 eyes watched. Even if Regulus had proof that Rowe had engineered this conspiracy, then what? Rowe was one of the sacred 28, an heir to a pure-blood house. What punishment would he face here? Detention, lost points, an apology? Regulus shook his head inwardly. That wouldn't suffice. Whatever old grudges existed between the Rowe family and the House of Black, whatever debts or favors linked Rowe to Voldemort, it wasn't relevant. The only certainty was this: Dolphin Rowe could not be allowed to graduate. Regulus withdrew his gaze. The malice still burned in his perception, a bright ball in the dark, and Roe remained in the corner smiling faintly, unaware that Regulus had seen through him and confirmed his intent. Let him keep thinking he was the hunter. Everyone else continued to watch Regulus. No one understood why he had suddenly stopped the final duel. No one spoke. If anyone else had done what Regulus did now, they might have been mocked, challenged, or questioned. But when Regulus moved, the room quieted and waited. It wasn't fear. People simply recognized the logic behind what he did and didn't demand an explanation. Even his harshest critics, the ones who thought the House of Black was nothing special and Regulus himself unremarkable, would not accuse him of flaunting his status. Those truly secure at the top do not need to shout to be seen. Veronica Yaxley stepped forward from behind Pollux, concern softening her features. She bowed slightly. Regulus, what is it? The Yaxleys in the House of Black were close, while Berga and Mrs. Yaxley were regular guests at one another's gatherings. It was only natural she would address him by name. Regulus nodded. A small matter that needs confirming. His gaze swept the common room, landed in the third-year area in a non-core section, and found Severus Snape. Snape sat slouched against the sofa, expression sullen, a few like him clustered nearby, half-bloods and those on the fringes of pure-blood society. They occupied a low, oppressive pocket of the room. Regulus called him plainly. Snape? His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Eyes followed and fixed on Snape, who looked up, surprised, alert, then something unreadable flickered across his face. Regulus's tone was casual. Go see if Sayre has taken any potion. The common room fell instantly silent. Conversations, whispering, the clink of wine glasses, all ceased. Only the fireplace crackled. Potion? What did that mean? Among the upper years, several who had been lounging straightened, exchanged glances, frowned, opened their mouths, then shut them. In Slytherin, the first-year prefect position was fiercely contested. Generations had passed on the significance of that role. Outward advantages could be bought, but in that circle, a young wizard had to rely on himself. Taking a potion to boost oneself was cheating, and the vilest kind. Anyone caught would never raise their head in Slytherin again. All eyes moved from Snape to Geoffrey. The boy in the center trembled uncontrollably, his face chalk white, the hand holding his wand shaking so badly the tip swayed and looked ready to drop. He couldn't speak. One thought consumed him. It's over, it's over, it's over. The upper years muttered. A potion? Are they mad? If he's exposed, he's finished. Do they want him to live? Who gave him the nerve? The question is, how was he found out? How did Black know? Snape rose and, under the full attention of the room, walked steadily to the center. Each step was measured. Inside, he was far from calm. Regulus had called him out publicly. Snape knew the chance this offered. If Black could detect that Geoffrey had been tampered with, Black likely had the means to look closer. If Black wanted to investigate himself, he could have walked over. Instead, he was giving Snape an opportunity. Snape needed it. He needed it desperately. But the gratitude that rose in him was mixed with shame. He did not want to owe anyone, especially not Regulus, but he already did. Still, this was another debt. Snape gripped his wand tightly and approached Geoffrey. The boy looked up at him with fear and pleading in his eyes. Snape did not meet his gaze more than necessary. He reached out his hand. Wand. Snape had already begun his examination. He picked up Geoffrey's wand, held it up to the light, and inspected it. The shaft, the core, the tip. He even brought it to his nose to sniff, letting no detail escape him. When he finished, he put the wand down, drew his own, and pointed it at Geoffrey, moving his lips in a silent incantation. No one could hear what he said, but everyone watched Geoffrey's body shudder. Snape frowned and repeated the spell. Then he stepped forward and pried Geoffrey's mouth open and leaned in to sniff. The action was blunt, almost crude, but he performed it with intense focus, the face of someone handling a rare potion ingredient rather than a boy in need of help. With his mouth held open, Geoffrey didn't dare move. The common room was hushed for nearly 2 minutes before Snape straightened and turned to Regulus. He drank something, he said, trying to steady his voice into calm. An enhancement-type potion. I can't confirm the precise ingredients yet, but that's what it is. A buzz rippled through the room. He actually drank it. He's got guts. Who gave it to him? How did he get that kind of potion? Who cares? He drank it. That's what matters. Snape lingered where he stood, aware of the stares. Some of the purebloods who'd normally never meet his eye had changed expression. It was hard to tell whether they looked on him with admiration or calculation, a desire to accept him or use him. For the moment, though, he was seen, and he liked it. He dropped his gaze and then looked at Regulus. Everyone else was looking at Regulus, too. He had been the one to discover Geoffrey had taken the potion, the one to halt the final duel and summon Snape. The two prefects stood nearby, watching him. Regulus rose and walked out from the sofas. The crowd parted instinctively, making a path. He walked to the center of the room, and Snape, as if about to speak, suppressed the urge when Regulus met his eye. There was nothing in that look, not a threat or a flourish, only a sweep and an acknowledgement, and Snape understood it. He composed himself and looked away. Geoffrey stood where he had been, numb, his face ashen and his eyes hollow. He took a reflexive step back as Regulus approached, then stopped. The excitement and agitation that had clung to him earlier had drained away. Only fear remained. Whatever the potion had put into him was still burning beneath his skin. On the surface, he seemed steadier, but inside the restlessness carried on of its own accord. Regulus could help suppress it, but there was no need. He turned to Veronica Yaxley. Confirmed. Announce the winner. Veronica nodded. She felt no grievance at Regulus's intervention. If he hadn't discovered the potion and something had gone wrong, she and Pollux, as prefects, would have been held responsible. She cleared her throat. The first-year chief for this year is Rosalie Selwyn. Geoffrey Seiler is disqualified. The common room erupted, clapping, whistles, the clink of glasses. Rosalie Selwyn, a sixth year from the Selwyn family, was surrounded by admirers, people laughing and slapping her on the back. Rosalie stood perfectly composed in the center. Regulus knew she was thrilled inside but able to control it. No one looked at Geoffrey anymore. He remained where he was, but everyone bypassed him to congratulate the rightful winner. Seeing the situation settled, Snape turned to leave. Regulus glanced in his direction, and Snape immediately stopped. At that moment, the common room door was flung open and Professor Slughorn hurried in. His robes were neat enough, though his hair was mussed, and his breathing a little ragged. He had clearly rushed across the castle. His eyes swept the room until they found Regulus, and he hurried over, uneasy. A message had been sent to him saying there was trouble in the common room. He had been hoping it wasn't anything serious. Slughorn's gaze landed on Geoffrey, and he halted, taking a careful look. He moved quickly to Geoffrey's side, wand already out, and chanted a few spells. Geoffrey shuddered. His color returned from ash gray to pale, stabilized though not fully recovered. The restlessness had been suppressed, temporarily calmed. Slughorn sheathed his wand and exhaled. Only then did he take in what had happened. A reckless first year had drunk a potion to gain an advantage. It was a troubling breach, but not beyond his ability to treat. Pollux Greengrass hurried over, his face uneasy. "Professor, I." Slughorn waved him off with a jolly smile. "It's all right, Mr. Greengrass. You couldn't be expected to identify such a potion." He patted Pollux on the shoulder. "Continue the festivities. Don't let this little incident ruin the welcome party." Relieved, Pollux exhaled. Veronica came forward and whispered to Slughorn. He listened, nodded, and glanced toward Regulus. It was no surprise that Regulus had spotted the potion. Slughorn studied him for a moment, then smiled. "Severus, perhaps you could help?" Snape stiffened for a heartbeat before collecting himself. Regulus could feel his emotions churning, excitement, surprise, and a faint awkwardness. He nodded slightly. Snape returned the nod to Slughorn and said in a level voice, "Very well, Professor." Together, Slughorn and Snape took Geoffrey and left the common room. The door closed behind them, and the party resumed. Lena and Samuel slipped back in at that moment, taking their places behind Alex as if nothing had happened, their faces composed. Regulus observed them, approving quietly. They knew how to play a role, to do small errands and then step back. For his circle, they were useful. Avery was the face, Alex the connector, Hermes the muscle, while Lena and Samuel handled the details. Pollux approached Regulus with a new request, polite and less familiar than before. "Mr. Black, in the next segment, the new chief may challenge the previous chief to receive guidance. What do you think?" Regulus had his own experiment to try and no objections. "Very well." Pollux hurried to bring Rosalie forward. She followed, calm and steady. The sixth-year Selwyn introduced her to Regulus. "Rosa, watch carefully and learn well. Black was last year's chief, his level." Regulus greeted Rosalie gently. "Miss Selwyn, you fought well tonight." "Thank you, Mr. Black," she replied, composed though clearly excited beneath the surface. Her brown hair was tied back and she stood upright, gripping her wand. Pollux cleared a space in the center of the common room. Avery leaned back on a sofa, interested. Alex glanced toward the center. Hermes looked bored. Lena watched Rosalie with envy. Samuel watched Regulus with admiration. Regulus and Rosalie faced each other, 7 or 8 meters apart, and the room quieted. Regulus watched Rosalie's magic signature. By his standards, it was faint, as if it would vanish with a breath, but it was alive and responded to her emotions. "Miss Selwyn," he said softly, "you may attack without holding anything back. Any spell you like." Rosalie nodded and gripped her wand. "You may even use your full strength," Regulus added. She paused. She had bound herself not to use full strength in previous matches, a habit taught by her father to always save something for a counterattack. It stung to be seen through, but she was used to the stories of Black at home. She squared her shoulders. "Mr. Black, I'm starting." "Incendio," she cried, and orange-red flames burst from her wand, rolling toward Regulus. He stood still. When the flames neared, he raised his wand and gave it a small, graceful flick. The fire veered aside as if brushed away, sweeping past him harmlessly. Rosalie shifted and cast, repelling charm. The invisible force struck out. Regulus pointed, and the spell detonated in midair and dissolved. She moved again. Impedimenta. A flash of purple struck from the side. Regulus turned slightly and slipped the spell past him. She fired a rapid succession. Stupefy, Petrificus Totalis, Expelliarmus. They came in rhythm rather than speed. Regulus tapped his wand twice. The Stupefy collided with the Petrificus Totalis in midair and exploded into light. The Expelliarmus was swatted away and slammed into the stone wall behind him. Rosalie circled, looking for angles, casting one spell after another. Regulus never counterattacked. He either deflected with a flick, stepped out of the way, or let the spells graze past as he redirected them with a touch. He didn't cast a single offensive spell. A group of upper-year witches watched, impressed. "Look at that movement when he turns," one whispered. "It's beautiful," another breathed. Rosalie's pace slowed, her spells weakened. Sweat stood at her brow and her breathing grew ragged. Regulus watched her magic signature lurch and falter. He glanced to Veronica, who understood immediately and stepped forward. "Stop!" Rosalie lowered her wand, panting. Veronica smiled at Regulus. "Thank you, Mr. Black, for your guidance. Miss Selwyn's performance is commendable." The sixth-year Selwyn came up to Regulus and offered his hand. "Black, thanks." Regulus shook it. "Rosalie is very talented," he said. Rosalie stood to the side, breath settling. The flush on her cheeks deepened and her eyes brighter. Regulus waited until her magic smoothed. Just as Veronica was about to close the segment, Regulus interrupted. "Veronica, wait a moment." She paused, making way. Regulus addressed the room. "The tradition of the new chief challenging the previous chief is a good one. Inheritance and guidance give newcomers a sense of what lies ahead and fit the spirit of Slytherin. I have a proposal. Beginning with me, the new chief may select one student to receive instruction from the previous chief." A hush fell. Regulus had long been aloof from house politics. Him taking the initiative surprised some. The sixth-year Selwyn reacted quickest. "This is an excellent idea. Rosa, thank Mr. Black." Regulus turned to Rosalie. "Tell me yourself. What do you want to learn?" Her heart leapt. She had always wanted to master the shield charm, Protego. She had tried and failed again and again, able only to form a thin, fragile film that burst at the slightest touch. Her father had told her the shield charm was an advanced technique and to take it slowly. At home, everyone talked about Black's shield from last year, how it could push wands away from a distance. Rosalie met his gaze and said, voice steady, "The shield charm, please." Regulus's mouth tilted. "Very well, cast it for me." She inhaled and raised her wand. "Protego." A faint silver light bled from the tip and took form, a translucent, fragile bubble like a soap film, edges trembling. It had no real defensive strength. Regulus stepped beside her. "Maintain it." She tightened her grip and pushed more of her magic into the charm. Regulus lifted his wand and placed its tip near hers. To the onlookers, it was a small glow, but at the magical level, he did something precise. He probed along their wands, feeling her traces of magic. They were loose and disordered, lacking cohesive direction. He did not seize control. He only guided, using his own magic to nudge and show her the right way to shape force. At the same time, a faint strand of protective imagery, an impression of what true defense felt like, flowed from him into her shield. Her charm changed. The edges that had been blurry drew together. The silver grew brighter, and the film thickened, from translucent into something solid and steady. Within seconds, a complete shield charm stood firm before her. Gasps rippled through the room. It worked. Is that a proper shield charm? My brother took half a year to do that. The sixth-year Selwyn's expression was complicated. He'd not made it look so easy when he'd practiced that spell himself. Regulus said, simply, "Remember that feeling. Practice it." Rosalie dispelled the shield and bowed slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Black." Her voice was calm, but her eyes shone. Regulus nodded, and Veronica clapped. "Tonight's welcome party ends here. Everyone, go and rest." The crowd began to disperse. Regulus scanned the room. The crowd was closing in. He knew the looks. Upperclassmen watching with guarded interest, lowerclassmen staring with hopeful hesitation. Some wanted to step forward and talk, but wouldn't dare. He could already anticipate the next hour. Jealousy, requests, thinly veiled demands. He just helped Rosalie cast a full shield charm in front of everyone. That wasn't a trivial favor. Being able to perform a true shield charm before adulthood and to use it effectively in practice marked someone as excellent. He'd made a first year do it openly. The effect was too obvious. Lower years would think, "Can you help me too?" Upper years would think, "How did he do that? Can you teach me?" And the ambitious would see an opening. Maybe I can use this to get closer to him. All of it meant trouble he didn't want to manage. Regulus turned and headed for the sofas. Avery still sat there, talking to a second year beside him. He looked up when Regulus sat down. "Avery," Regulus said, leaning close. "Leave the rest to you. Remember what I told you. Tradition, heritage, the Slytherin spirit. Say it like this was the previous leader's reward and encouragement to the new leader. Keep that tone." Avery blinked, then Regulus gave his shoulder a reassuring pat and stood. He glanced at Hermes and Alex. They both rose immediately. Regulus walked out. The crowd made a path without even thinking. He nodded to a few faces and went straight through them. Alex and Hermes followed. The three of them left as if nothing had happened. Avery sat frozen for a moment, watching Regulus's back disappear through the common room door. Then images flashed through his mind. His father at home, discussing business, reclining on a sofa, speaking deliberately and occasionally sipping tea. Ministry officials entering the house, some courteous, some arrogant, and his father always the same calm center. He recalled newspaper photos of his father in the ministry corridors, speaking with people, the posture and bearing he'd seen so often. It fit. Avery straightened, a small smile forming, reserved yet sincere, not perfect, but right in feeling. His voice came out a touch high, but steadier than usual. "Everyone, Mr. Black asked me to say a few words." The room quieted, attention shifting toward him. Avery continued, "Slytherin's tradition depends on the heritage each generation hands down. Tonight, you all saw it, the challenge of the new leader and the guidance of the one before. This is what Slytherin should look like." He let his eyes sweep the room. Mr. Black said that was the previous leader's reward and encouragement to the new leader. He hopes this tradition continues to be passed on, and he also hopes. His gaze landed on Rosalie. "Miss Selwyn, remember tonight's feeling so you can carry this spirit forward." Rosalie nodded, solemn and earnest, as if accepting a heavy responsibility. Around them, conversations broke out, some approving, some thoughtful, some dismissive. A strange satisfaction warmed Avery. He realized he was good at this. Outside, the common room noise stayed muffled behind the closed door. The corridor was empty, torchlight low, and the stairs leading up into shadow. Regulus, Alex, and Hermes walked in that hush, their footsteps echoing. They passed the 8th floor, where portraits murmured. Barnabas the barmy was still fussing over a lesson, and Regulus paced 3 times before a tapestry to summon the hidden door. He stepped into the room of requirement and stopped to look at Alex. Alex had been quiet since they left. Regulus had watched the way he watched the demonstration, how a flick of a wand in a first year had produced a perfect shield charm. It had looked so easy. Alex's talent had never been remarkable. Tonight's display must have stung. If Regulus could do that for Rosalie, could he do the same for Alex? Alex, Regulus said calmly, a question. Alex looked up. Is power better when it's your own or someone else's? Of course my own is better, Alex answered without hesitation. Regulus glanced at Hermes, who leaned against the door with his head down. Do you want your safety to be something not in your own hands? Alex understood immediately. For all its appeal, borrowed power meant vulnerability. He hesitated, then shook his head. I don't. But in the private corners of his mind, he still wondered, if Regulus offered, could he catch up? Could he stop being the weak one? He kept that thought to himself. Regulus's question made him think instead of plead. He lowered his eyes and said nothing more. And you? Regulus asked Hermes. Hermes folded his arms. I don't want it. Regulus let the answer hang a moment. He knew Hermes had seen combat. In real fighting, anything that wasn't truly yours could be fatal. Hermes knew what Regulus meant. Rosalie had produced a shield charm of remarkable quality, but if it hadn't become hers, what she'd used was only borrowed. Hermes looked thoughtful. That spell, it didn't belong to her, did it? Regulus didn't give a direct yes or no. He asked, how did Mr. Mulciber teach you dark arts? Hermes' eye twitched, like a memory he didn't enjoy. He demonstrated and then made me feel it. Feel what? Regulus pressed. The things needed to cast dark arts. Anger, the urge to kill, the instinct to destroy. He let me experience how he did it first, then I tried. Regulus nodded. Some spells require particular emotions or a force of will to activate. A skilled wizard can lead a learner into experiencing that feeling first, pointing them in the right direction. But that's not the same as giving them the power. What Mulciber did was plant the emotional route. It didn't magically transfer mastery. That, Regulus thought, was exactly what he had done with Rosalie. He had used his presence, his spirit, to guide her practice, to let her feel what a shield charm should be. The unwillingness to be struck, the instinct to refuse harm. The shield charm's essence is not simply a wall, it's the desire not to be hurt. Many people can't form that resolve, so the spell fails. If Rosalie left believing she had mastered the shield charm because she'd felt it guided by someone else, she would be mistaken. Without making the magic her own, leaving a personal imprint, she'd be relying on what Regulus had given her. He'd done it on impulse at the moment. He hadn't prepared or rehearsed. A wizard strong enough, with precise control and a forceful spirit, could do that to a younger witch or wizard. The protective image, the thought of Sirius, had only smoothed the process. It was a shortcut, not the key. A truly capable wizard would see tonight as a guided demonstration, not the end of the story. Rosalie would have to practice to experience and internalize the spell herself. If she didn't, that would be on her. This would spread tonight. By morning, Rosalie would get letters from home, instructions, expectations. Then there was her family, the Selwyns. Regulus ran through what he knew. One of the Sacred 28, they hadn't had a clear record in the First War. Some members may have fought, others might have claimed Imperius afterwards to avoid punishment. In the Second War, they sided with Voldemort, but the Selwyn who'd turned up beside him tonight was only a sixth-year student. The Selwyns were not like the calculating Malfoys, not the frenzied Lestranges, not the purely violent Rose. They were more like dependable thugs, useful for carrying out orders, willing to be useful. There were places to cooperate with families like that. Umbridge had even lied about being related to a Selwyn later to gain advantage. None of it mattered now. Everything Regulus had done this evening, seeing through Geoffrey, finding the mastermind, accepting the challenge, giving on-the-spot guidance, letting Snape appear, letting Avery speak, had one central aim. He was testing a hypothesis. Since Sirius had been integrated into the Star Trek system, Regulus had been forming theories about what would cause the system to respond. One idea was that it required a deliberate, decisive outward action, not merely a passive reaction. Another was that it required piercing insight, seeing what others could not, and using that insight to achieve an effect. Tonight he had seen through Geoffrey's problem when no one else had, and he had nearly uncovered Dolphin Rowe's role behind the scenes. That was the seeing through part. As for achieving the goal, it didn't need to be grand. Small, measurable gains would do for the test, earning prestige, demonstrating power, consolidating position, exerting influence. Accepting the challenge and performing well showed composure and strength. Guiding a shield charm showed practical ability, allowing Snape to appear and Slughorn to intervene, letting Avery speak. Each action nudged the outside world and shaped perception. These small moves might be enough to seed a memory. In Slytherin, that memory could ferment. Tomorrow and the days after, people would keep talking about tonight, saying Black was powerful, generous, a preserver of tradition. That was how prestige is built. How strongly the reaction would compound and how long it would last was uncertain. He would have to wait. But whether Sirius would show a flicker of change, like Rigel's response to the Abyssal Whisper's mental corruption, would tell him if this path was right. If the star warmed slightly, his hypothesis would be supported. If it didn't, he'd try a different approach. He looked at Alex. Alex still stared at the floor. Regulus said no more. Some lessons a person had to discover alone. There's time tonight, he added. If you want to practice, do it on your own. Hermes moved toward the training ground. Alex watched their backs for a moment, then rose and followed them slowly. Chapter 213, The Interesting Aspects of Magic. Regulus sat cross-legged on the floor and murmured a single word, ritual. He had only a vague, general understanding of ritual magic. It wasn't something completed with a single incantation. It required multiple steps, precise conditions, sometimes sacrifices, contracts, and a more elaborate magical framework. Its feedback was usually intense, and the cost usually high. Animagus transformation fit the pattern. A fixed sequence, long-term steps, specific materials, celestial alignment, environmental conditions. Succeed, and you gained an animal form while keeping your mind intact. Fail, and you could be trapped half human, half beast forever. Lord Voldemort's resurrection was another example. Bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy. 3 indispensable elements acquired in 3 different ways, each with a different magical meaning. If the ritual worked, it rebuilt a complete body, possibly stronger than before. If it failed, who knew what would happen? The unbreakable vow was the same. Once established, it was an absolute bond at the soul level. Breaking it meant death, no negotiation. The Fidelius charm, hiding a secret permanently inside a secret keeper's soul, so only that person could reveal it. That was ritual too. Lily's sacrificial protection for Harry was another kind. A voluntary death, used to weave a barrier of love that repelled death for others. Regulus thought about these rituals and saw a common thread. They left marks at the soul level, and when they worked, their effects far exceeded ordinary spells. They tended to be irreversible. Then there was Sirius. His guesses about Sirius led him somewhere else. Sirius, he suspected, might require the first truly active, decisive exertion of influence on the outside world, not just a passive response. It might be about perceiving things others couldn't and using that perception to act. It might demand accepting that sharpness brings destruction, and yet choosing to use that sharpness anyway. If that were true, the process itself resembled a ritual. Long-term preparation, strict conditions, potent effects, and a soul-level involvement. Rigel was different. Rigel was inward, protection, self-boundaries. Abstract, but straightforward. Know what you want to protect, and you can kindle it. Sirius seemed to be outward, extending influence, seeking feedback from the world. 2 paths, one toward inner solidity, the other toward outward expansion. Could they be walked at the same time? Could they run parallel? Could they enhance each other? Regulus had no answer. He wasn't even sure his guess pointed in the right direction. Then a sharper question surfaced. Feedback. If lighting Sirius were a ritual that required certain actions, who or what would provide that feedback? How would the world respond? Was it the wand, the caster, or some deeper invisible rule baked into the world that automatically answered those who completed a ritual? Regulus didn't know. Records of ritual magic were murky. Successes were celebrated, failures buried. The real secrets might be locked away in family vaults or in a few people's memories, not in library books. The restricted section likely held leads. That would be his next stop. He pushed those thoughts aside for now. There was something enticing about the unknown. What good were the spells you could read at a glance or learn in a single lesson? The ones that couldn't be figured out were the ones worth spending a lifetime on. He closed his eyes and sank his consciousness inward. In his inner landscape, 6 stars still orbited. Betelgeuse burned at a distance, Rachel guarded the center, and Sirius gleamed faintly in the lower right. His soul figure stood where the lights converged, quietly luminous. He focused on Sirius. Its light was peculiar, neither as fierce as Betelgeuse nor as gentle as Rigel. It hadn't changed. It remained a thin, weak glow, almost like an emotion. I'm just here. If you don't have the ability, don't bother me. The lack of change was information, too. It suggested his guess might be right, but the timing wrong, or the path itself could be wrong and require restarting, or it might simply need the right opportunity, the way Rigel had taken months to go from a faint spark to a steady glow. What he was doing now was planting a seed. Watering and tending would come later. Whether it sprouted and when it did would be up to chance. If it failed, he could try elsewhere. For now, he would observe Sirius and verify his theory over time. Maybe one day it would brighten a little while his attention was elsewhere, like Rigel had when he had resisted the abyssal whisper. Regulus withdrew his thoughts and stopped chasing questions with no answers at present. He stood, lingered a moment in the little hut, then sat back down. There was still the matter of the spatial network. After more than 3 hours of work in the hut, the spatial network had grown from 5 spells to 6. That extra spell complicated everything. Trajectories, intersection control, timing of exits, all had to be recalculated. With 5 channels, there had been 10 main trajectories and 8 intersection points. Adding one more increased the main trajectories to 14 and the intersections to 15. 4 more paths meant 7 additional possible collision points. Every one required precise calculation. Regulus spent 2 hours modeling the system and another hour debugging. Finally, it worked. 6 spells ran through the network simultaneously, staggered, not interfering with each other. He could release them whenever he wanted, from whichever exit he chose. Regulus pushed the hut door open and looked toward the training ground. Alex was sprawled on the earth, gasping, chest heaving. Clearly exhausted, Regulus ignored him. In the dummy area, Hermes still stood among 4 practice automatons, a shield charm braced in front of him. The barrier took hit after hit. Each impact cracked a piece of it, and Hermes gritted his teeth to replenish his magic. Raise it again, have it shatter, replenish again. Regulus watched, amused. Earlier Hermes had seemed to disdain external power, as if anything that didn't come from him was worthless. Yet here he was, practicing the shield charm. He cared, but wanted to improve through his own effort rather than take shortcuts like Alex. Regulus flicked his hand to halt the dummies. Hermes kept his shield up, unaware for a second. Then he turned his head slowly, eyelids heavy, looked at Regulus, and lowered the shield. He stumbled over to Alex and collapsed on the ground, limbs splayed, chest heaving, eyes half closed, waiting to be picked up. Regulus could only shake his head silently at the obviousness of it all. He ignored them and crossed to the dummy ring. He raised his hand, pushed out a thread of magical energy, and the dummies moved again. This time he didn't let them cast. He set them to maximum speed. Their motions became almost invisible, black blurs flashing through the air. Hermes, still on the ground, turned his head and his eyes widened. That's speed. Regulus stood among the automatons without looking at him and began his work. He cast Space Leap to lay down a channel, then anchored it, 12 anchors in all, each fixing an independent subchannel. He connected them into a network, set the flow so the currents circulated and changed constantly. Then he raised his wand and fed 6 Expelliarmus spells into the system in quick succession. Red light blinked into the channels and vanished, so short a distance that, from outside, it looked like he was only pointing his wand at the air a few times. Inside the network, however, the 6 spells raced along the 12 channels at high speed, weaving and crossing. Regulus followed their trajectories mentally, watching every path. After a measured 10 seconds, he opened 6 exits at once. 6 spells shot out simultaneously from 6 separate anchor points, knitting together like a net in midair and striking 6 dummies at the same time. The dummies' practice wands flew from their hands and clattered to the ground. Hermes lay there staring at Regulus's back. 6 spells, fired from 6 different points, appearing as if from nowhere. He imagined, If those were not merely Expelliarmus but Avada Kedavra, how could he defend? A shield charm might block one, but six arriving simultaneously from different directions, where could he dodge? It was simply impossible. He let out a small, helpless twitch of a smile and closed his eyes. Why worry about it? Even without this trick, I couldn't beat him. Better to wait to be picked up. Regulus withdrew his magic. The network faded. He stood there for a moment, thinking about the numbers and the possibilities. 6 was a success. He could add more, 7, 8, 9, as long as his mind and calculations could keep pace. If he only wanted volume in a single cast, he didn't need such a complicated circulating network. He could simply arrange the spells to exist simultaneously for a fraction of a second and fire them all at once, reducing the computational load and potentially allowing 10 or more at once. For now, though, this was a satisfying step forward. The next morning, Regulus woke up full of energy. He washed and moved about as usual, showing no sign of fatigue. Hermes was up as well. Ever since enrolling last year, he'd been a late nighter, and after spending every evening this semester practicing with Regulus until midnight, he'd developed a good reserve of stamina. He could get up without anyone calling him. The others fared worse. Alex had pushed himself until he collapsed during practice the previous day. He was awake now, but his whole body ached, and he couldn't manage to get out of bed. Avery had also slept poorly. When Regulus had brought the two of them back the night before, Avery had been tossing and turning, giggling under the covers, a soft, repressed laugh that leaked out in little hee-hee noises. Seeing Regulus arrive, he had tried to climb up and keep talking. Being watched and listened to by everyone had thrilled him. For a pure-blood young master, it had been a rare, intoxicating taste of adulthood. He'd discovered he liked standing before a crowd, speaking, and having people pay attention. He'd been too excited to sleep, so he couldn't get up this morning. After washing, Hermes went to the beds and began kicking each in turn. "Get up!" Alex groaned and rolled over. Avery buried his head beneath his pillow. Hermes kicked again. "Class!" At last the two of them stirred, climbing out of bed with groans. Alex clutched his waist, face contorted in pain. Avery's hair was a bird's nest, his eyes barely open as he mumbled incoherently. Regulus came out of the washroom, glanced at them, said nothing, and pushed the dormitory door open. In the common room he spotted Snape immediately. The potions master, or rather, the boy who behaved as if he were always keeping one careful step apart, was slumped in an armchair by the fireplace. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his robes were creased, and his hair looked greasier than the day before. Yet his expression carried a faint, almost feverish excitement. That particular glow people get after staying up all night and coming away with something they want. Regulus guessed what had happened. Snape had spent the previous evening alone with Professor Slughorn. He must have gained some measure of approval, attention, or appreciation. For him, those things mattered more than almost anything. When Regulus appeared, Snape sprang to his feet a bit too quickly, an impatient movement that faltered into a moment of awkward composure. He smoothed his robe, though there was nothing to be smoothed. It sat too large on him and was rumpled from sleep, then forced his voice to its usual flat, heavy tone. "Black!" Regulus inclined his head once. "Snape!" Snape said, without preamble, "The professor asked you to come to his office after breakfast." He searched Regulus's face for a reaction. There was nothing. Regulus simply said, "Understood," and turned away. Snape watched him go, stunned for a moment. He had expected some sign of condescension, some small display of superiority. After all, it had been Regulus who had allowed him to be brought to Slughorn and who had mentioned him to the professor. Snape had spent the night receiving attention and approval he had never dared hope for, and the source of it all had been Regulus. A bit of hauteur, a patronizing pat on the shoulder, or even just a few polite words of thanks would have been the ordinary response. Instead, there was nothing. Regulus's face remained as calm and indifferent as in their other encounters, as if Snape were someone entirely unconnected to him. The feeling that rose in Snape's chest was complicated, wariness mixed with a grudging recognition that this detachment was, perhaps, the proper manner of a true pure blood. He stood there a long while before turning away. After breakfast, Regulus made his way to Slughorn's office. The door was open. He knocked lightly on the jamb and received Slughorn's booming, "Come in." The office was warm. A fire burned in the grate, and a teapot hovered over the desk. Pouring itself into a cup, Slughorn sat behind the desk with a broad smile. "Regulus, sit down, let's talk." Regulus sat opposite him. "Good morning, Professor." Slughorn's praise came at once. "Your performance last night was splendid. I heard about it. The way you guided, the posture, it had the true Slytherin style." Regulus inclined his head. "You flatter me, Professor." "No flattery," Slughorn waved a hand. "I heard about that shield charm of yours." Rosalie cast it on the spot. "For a first year, that's no mean feat." Then Slughorn adopted a mock show of annoyance. "But you did cause me a bit of trouble, you know." Regulus lifted his head, first adopting an apologetic look and then one of mild puzzlement, playing along with the professor's tone. "This morning, several students came to me, asking if Black could give them guidance too, if they might learn a spell on the spot like Rosalie did." Slughorn spread his hands and shook his head. "I told them to build a foundation first. Your method isn't something everyone can be taught." Regulus understood perfectly. Slughorn was warning him that offering shortcuts to inexperienced students could do more harm than good. Showing a shortcut would distract them from mastering basics. Regulus nodded. "I'm sorry for the trouble, Professor." Slughorn waved it off. "Nonsense. You did very well. Inheritance. How wonderful. And as you said, it was the predecessor's reward and encouragement for the new prefect." He winked. Regulus smiled in reply, and the small matter seemed settled. Slughorn's face grew serious. "Regulus, I called you today mainly to ask, did you find anything odd about Salar?" Regulus's gaze dropped. He had found something. The potion, the strange compound, had been only the front. The Rowe family, quiet, shadowy actors, were the ones really behind it. Geoffrey Salar had been pushed forward to take the fall, while the Rowes pulled the strings. There could even be others farther back. But what good would telling Slughorn do? Who could he question? What evidence could be produced? The Rowe family was closely tied to darker circles. Regulus stayed silent for a long moment. Slughorn did not press him. He simply watched. Finally, Regulus met the professor's eyes and asked carefully, "Professor, do you think there was something wrong with the potion Salar took?" Slughorn's face shifted at once. The question carried a weight beneath it. Regulus wasn't answering directly. He was hinting, and that meant whatever he had found was significant or awkward to put into words. Slughorn thought for a moment. "That potion is odd." Regulus leaned forward, attentive. "It was a crude mixture," Slughorn continued. "Poor formula, low-grade ingredients. In an experienced adult, the effects would have been much worse. But the timing, the duration was tailored, just long enough for a newly enrolled first year to get through a few duels and then fail." He shook his head. "The damage is substantial. That boy won't be able to cast properly for months. Until his magic recovers, even something like a simple levitation could go awry." Slughorn looked Regulus in the eye as if searching him. Regulus returned the gaze and asked plainly, "So is it just inferior and careless, or was it deliberately designed that way?" Slughorn's expression altered. An inferior brew whose effects were nonetheless timed to a precise window suggested intent. To make a first year shine briefly, so they're seen, so they're praised, and then have them collapse later, that was a strategy. Salar had been a useful pawn. The real target was someone else. Slughorn's thoughts turned to the cancelled duel last night, to Regulus's sudden intervention, to Salar's original target, the previous prefect. He paused a long moment, then let out a soft, dismissive chuckle and pushed the worry aside. "Never mind. The important thing is the boy was saved and nothing worse happened." He beamed. "You did absolutely right, Regulus. You noticed, didn't act rashly, and called for a professor." Regulus answered simply, "I did what I should." Slughorn rapped the desk pleasantly. "Slytherin earns 30 points. And about that shield charm, if you have time, would you show others some pointers? Not teach it outright on the spot, mind, but indicate the direction they should take." Regulus allowed a small smile. "If an opportunity arises." They chatted a little longer, then Regulus rose. "Professor, I must go to class." "Do come by for tea sometime," Slughorn added. "I've just got some delightful candied fruit in." Regulus inclined his head and left. The office door closed behind him, and the corridor fell quiet. The events of last night fermented exactly as Regulus had expected, only the direction had shifted a little. He had underestimated the younger students' hunger for shortcuts, especially those from half-blood or lesser pure-blood families with an adult wizard at home. Compared to Muggleborns, they knew a little, but not enough. They knew the shield charm was difficult, and they knew many adult wizards in their families couldn't cast it cleanly. So when Regulus had demonstrated, their eyes lit with envy, as if he'd revealed some incredible trick. "So that's how you practice the shield charm? So you can practice it like that? Someone can just point their wand and let a first-year cast a full barrier? Why can't my dad do it if no one helps him?" They didn't think deeper, and no one of sufficient skill bothered to explain that the method was only a trick, a way to give someone the feeling of the spell in advance. To truly master a charm, you still had to practice it yourself. They only saw the result. Overnight, the older students who could cast a complete shield charm were in demand. Corridors and common rooms swarmed with lower years, clustering and asking questions. "Senior, can you teach me like Black did? Senior, is there some secret to the shield charm?" Those being asked reacted in various ways. Some were honest. "I can't. That probably requires special technique or higher skill." Some fumbled and, after enough pestering, started saying things vaguely plausible. A Gryffindor fifth-year boy leaned back on a sofa and told the first-years around him, "Well, Black's method isn't something just anyone can use. It requires, special control. You lot aren't ready yet. Practice the basics first." He said it with a straight face without really knowing what he meant, and the first-years nodded eagerly. A Ravenclaw fourth-year girl, on the other hand, invented a more elaborate story. She lowered her voice. "Actually, the secret to the shield charm is, don't tell anyone. You have to imagine someone you really dislike and amplify that feeling of not wanting them to touch you." She looked around conspiratorially. "It's best if you call them over and have them confess their love to you." Several first-year girls brightened. "Really?" "Of course," the senior affirmed with mock gravity. Nearby, the boy who'd once been tricked into confessing rolled his eyes. He'd been lured into making a public declaration and humiliated. Now, seeing the secret repeated so seriously, he finally understood, but all he could do was blame his own naivete. The truly old pure-blood families didn't get caught up in the uproar. They had people to ask. A volley of owls had left last night and brought replies by morning, though the tone of the letters wasn't exactly gentle. Most told the students to practice their basics and not to chase illusions. One admonished them to keep on good terms with the Black heir, quietly, not annoyingly. A sixth-year boy sighed over such a letter. The family agreed the method was clever but unsuitable for ordinary students and advised him to focus on what he should be doing. He put the letter away and told no one. In Gryffindor, James Potter had also heard about the demonstration. He knew the shield charm. He'd been able to cast it since last term. Whether by natural talent for dueling or hard practice after being bested by Regulus, he could produce a barrier, but barely. Last semester, it was enough to hold off some of Sirius's spells. This semester, Sirius kept breaking through with random hexes. Once could be an accident, twice luck, but 3 times suggested a real problem. James had been stewing, but hadn't asked outright. Now the news of Regulus's feat prompted a thought. During History of Magic, Professor Binns droned on, and nobody listened anyway. James nudged Sirius, who startled. James leaned close with an air of mystery. "Sirius, can you do that too?" Sirius frowned. "Do what?" James's voice dropped, though not very quietly. "That thing. You made a lot of progress over the holidays. Can you point your wand and teach someone the shield charm?" Several nearby students pricked up their ears, pretending to read while really listening. Sirius's face tightened. He opened his mouth, then shut it. If James was comparing him to Regulus, it stung. He had trained with Hawk all holiday and improved fast, but Regulus was on another level entirely. How could he say, "My brother can do it, but I can't"? How could he tell James that there was no secret technique in the House of Black, only Regulus's freakish talent? Sirius's expression changed, and finally he snapped, "Just listen to the lecture." James blinked and shrugged. He'd try again back at the dormitory. Nearby, Lily's ears flicked up and she looked over, curious. Things were fermenting among the Ravenclaws as well. Professor Flitwick found himself cornered by a few of them. "Professor, how did Black manage that shield charm? What's the principle? Can we learn it?" Perched on a stack of books, Flitwick shook his head, smiling. "That's a very advanced technique. Simply put, it's using your own magic to guide another's, letting them experience what the spell should feel like in advance. It's not a shortcut, just a form of inspiration." "Can we be inspired too?" one student asked. Flitwick winked. "The inspirer needs to be sufficiently skilled. If you want inspiration, find someone who is already that skilled." The students exchanged glances and fell quiet. Professor McGonagall was less gentle. When a few Gryffindor lower years piped up about the shield charm, she scolded them. "Shield charm? You haven't even mastered basic transfiguration, and you're thinking about that? Go and practice turning matches into needles 100 more times." They slunk away in Professor Sprout's greenhouse. The atmosphere was milder, but the refusal was blunt. "No." Regulus stood at the potting bench, and before he could finish his sentence, the professor, mid-repotting a mandrake, had cut him off. He tried another tack. "Professor, I want to study the magical properties of the humping willow." Sprout looked up. "Study? With what?" "With my eyes and with magic perception," Regulus said. "I won't touch it, break it, or harm it." She stared for a long moment, then sighed and set down her tools. "Mr. Black, do you know how rare a whomping willow is?" Regulus shook his head, though he knew in part. Sprout went to the window and pointed to the swaying tree in the distance. "That one is over 200 years old. Do you know why it was planted there?" "To protect the entrance to the shack," he ventured. Sprout shook her head. "That shack didn't exist back then." She turned back to him. "There's another one, a seedling I planted myself 30 years ago. It's only just left the seedling stage. Not nearly adult." She explained, "The growth cycle is long. 30 years as a seedling, another 30 in the growth stage, then it finally reaches a stable adulthood, 60 years from planting to maturity. So in all of Britain, there are only 2 presentable humping willows, one at Hogwarts and one I'm raising," she summarized. Regulus paused, then asked, "Can they be bought?" Sprout shook her head. "Not legitimately. Occasionally seedlings show up on the black market for 5,000 to 8,000 galleons each, but the survival rate is low. You'll probably buy a dead one. As for adults, they have a price, but no one sells." Regulus did quick math. 8,000 galleons could buy more than 50 mandrakes at 150 each. 20 mandrakes were 3,000. The mandrake investment had already yielded the disintegration curse, a trump card. Even a humping willow several times more expensive might be justifiable if it helped develop a new spell, but paying thousands for a likely dead seedling wasn't worth it. He asked, "What about in the wild? Do wild whomping willows exist?" Sprout looked up. "Not giving up, are you?" Regulus glanced down, a little embarrassed. Sprout continued, "There are a few wild adults in the Bulgarian magic sanctuary. Some grow on the edge of the Romanian dragon sanctuary, mixed in near the habitats of other magical creatures. There's an old manor in southern France rumored to have one in a private collection, and deep in Germany's Black Forest there are stories, though nothing confirmed." She looked at him. "Planning to go abroad to find one?" "No," Regulus said. "Just asking." Sprout watched him for a while, then laughed softly. "I can probably guess what you're thinking." He said nothing. She walked back to the bench, picked up a pot of mandrake seedling, examined it, and spoke as she worked. "The humping willow's magic is special. When it attacks, it doesn't rely on brute force so much as conduction. Its assault follows the magical energy and drills into the target's interior, triggering vibrations from within. If a stone is whipped by it, you might only see a mark on the outside, but the inside could already be shattered." Regulus repeated 2 words to himself: vibration, conduction. He thought of the disintegration curse. An ordinary blasting curse was an outward explosion, blowing things apart from the exterior. The willow's shattering from the inside was different, smarter. It would be particularly effective against tightly connected materials, stone, metal, the physical structures of magical constructs. That was precisely what he needed. The disintegration curse handled living things. A willow's shattering could handle hard matter. One targeted life, the other targeted substance. They complemented each other perfectly. He pressed for more: how the magic was conducted, how the vibrations were triggered, how different materials reacted. Sprout answered in detail and held nothing back. When she finished, she asked, "Is that enough?" Regulus bowed his head briefly. "Yes, thank you, Professor." "All right, off you go," she said, waving him away. "And don't get any ideas about the one in the castle. That one isn't mine. It belongs to Hogwarts." "I promise not to touch it," he replied and started to leave. Sprout called after him. "Mr. Black." He turned back. She regarded him with a sober expression. "If one day you do find a humping willow and research something about it, remember to tell me." Regulus answered solemnly, "I will." He pushed the greenhouse door open and went out. Professor Sprout watched it close and shook her head. She had a good idea what the boy intended, but she wouldn't stop him. If he could research it, that would be his achievement. If he failed, that would be his affair as well. Chapter 216, Teaching Lily the Ironclad Spell. The first Friday in October dawned perfect. Sunlight slanted through the high library windows, cutting warm bands of light across the tables. Outside, the Black Lake shimmered. On the lawn by the water, many young students walked, sat and chatted, or played. Regulus sat in his usual corner by the window with a heavy book open before him, an illustrated guide to magical plants of Britain and surrounding areas. He turned to the entry on the humping willow, read a few lines, and turned the page. The book contained only standard information: origin, morphology, care notes, danger level. Who discovered it and when, where it grew, what environment it needed, what to watch for when it attacked. There wasn't a single word about the plant's magical properties. That was normal. Like fantastic beasts and where to find them, Newt only described habits, distribution, and breeding methods. He left out the magical principles. If Newt cataloged the exact magic of every beast, he might unwittingly teach people how to exploit them. Without trade, there's less killing. Without detailed research, there's no targeting. The same logic applied to magical plants. Regulus could only guess. He skimmed familiar names, looking for clues. For the rare entries, the notes were brief. Just a name, the place of discovery, and a few characteristics. But often those characteristics hinted at the plant's magic. Frost-weeping tulips only bloom at the first snowfall. Their petals freeze without withering and drip a cold liquid in sunlight. Touching the liquid makes you remember your saddest memory. Regulus suspected their magic involved frozen memories, an ability to seal away a memory. If extracted, it might be used to lock away painful recollections or, conversely, to trap someone in an inescapable sorrow. Silent moss grows over stone tablets in ancient ruins. Anyone who touches it temporarily loses the ability to speak, unable even to cast spells. Its nature might be connected to language or directly nullify the act of spellcasting. If one could extract it, perhaps it could be used to stifle an opponent's magic. Shadowlight grass only glows in absolute darkness. The darker it is, the brighter it shines, but the faintest other light makes it go out. Regulus thought it was sensitive to light or exclusive in nature, something that wishes to exist in purity and cannot tolerate interference. If harvested, it might make a detection charm, or conversely, a darkness that chokes out all light. He memorized the names and his conjectures. If he ever encountered specimens, he could verify them with magic perception and natural magic. For now, he filed them away in his head and kept flipping pages. The sun slid westward, the light moving from one side of the table to the other. Footsteps approached, and Regulus glanced up. Lily stood across the table with several books cradled in her arms. He nodded. "Lily." She sat down and set her books on the table. "Regulus." They fell into silence, each opening their own book. The library was very still, only the soft whir of pages, the echo of footsteps, and Madame Pince's occasional cough. Outside, the light shifted, turning orange-red and bathing the wood in a warm glow. Lily closed her book. Regulus did the same. They looked up at the same moment, and Lily was the first to smile. "You've been getting famous lately." Regulus's expression was gentle. He didn't answer. Lily blinked, curiosity brightening her face. "Is it true? Did you really make a first-year cast a complete shield charm?" Regulus hummed once. "If you put it that way, yes," he added. "But you must have heard. What they experienced was a shortcut. Letting them feel it in advance isn't the same as actually teaching them." Lily had heard. The professors had nearly grabbed first years by the ears to warn them away from the technique, and in the dorm she'd been bombarded by Marcia Fleury's excited gossip. Marcia's father had said it didn't seem like something a young student could manage. Lily didn't fully understand. She could not cast a complete shield charm herself. At best, a wisp of silver light sprayed from the tip of her wand, a thin veil that wasn't even a proper barrier. Upperclassmen told her she would manage once she was older. Once her magic was stronger, her body more developed, and her intent firmer. Others said it demanded a conviction to refuse harm, a genuine desire to protect something, ideally oneself. Lily suspected she lacked that drive. Her family wasn't wealthy, but her parents loved her, and her sister loved her too. In 2+ years at Hogwarts, she had weathered insults, but no real harm. She could not imagine the need to steel herself against danger. Professor McGonagall said that method isn't suitable for young students? Lily asked. Yes, Regulus's answer was measured. At least for students without skilled spellcasters at home, it's not suitable. Lily fell silent. She understood. He meant resources. Those with skilled spellcasters at home could perform the shortcut. Those without had to endure and wait. She was the only witch in her family. She remembered her parents' last letter. Small talk threaded with concern. Are you short of anything? Are you eating enough? Lily had read it and felt warmth then, but now Regulus's words left a sour taste. Was the gap in background really this big? She didn't say it aloud, but Regulus noticed. He could sense the slight dimming in her magical aura as she listened. He didn't rush to comfort her with empty platitudes. These were objective realities, part of what many Muggleborns had to face. He had told her before that background mattered just as much as talent. Pureblood families could raise useless heirs. Muggleborns could become powerful witches and wizards. But words only do so much. She would need to find her own way. Regulus simply sat and looked at her with a patient expression. After a while, Lily looked up again, studying him, his gentleness, his tolerant look, as if at a child who needed care. She gave him a mock complaint. Why aren't you comforting me? Regulus raised an eyebrow. Lily continued softly, a little aggrieved. You know there's no one else who can teach me at home. You know how I'd read what you said. Why aren't you comforting me? Regulus's mouth curved slightly. Because I know you're a strong witch. Lily blinked, then Regulus went on. You won't be defeated by this. You'll figure it out yourself and move forward. She stared for a long moment, then laughed, a small, surprised laugh. You're doing that again. Regulus didn't know what that entailed, but he didn't argue. He said simply. Lily looked at him, the question hanging in her eyes. Come on, tell me, what are you doing this time? Regulus cleared his throat. Lily, do you want to feel what a shield charm is like? Her attention snapped to him. She frowned. But you said it wasn't suitable for young students? I also said that if a sufficiently skilled spellcaster is involved, it's possible, he answered. She paused, thinking. After a moment, she nodded. Here? Here is fine, he said. She checked around in a small whisper. Do we need wands? Madame Pince doesn't allow wands in the library. Regulus shook his head. No, I'm just letting you experience it. He signaled for her to lean in a little. Lily obliged, closing the distance. Regulus reached out. His fingertip hovered about 2 inches above her brow. A wisp of silver light spilled from his fingertip. Gentle, not blinding. Like a small orb condensed from moonlight, it drifted and touched her skin. The instant it met her, it dispersed and merged into her. Lily's eyes widened. Her body stiffened for a heartbeat and then relaxed again. Regulus withdrew his finger, and the silver faded away. For a few seconds, she sat motionless, eyes open but unfocused. Then she blinked, and her gaze cleared, the surprise in it even greater than before. Remember this feeling, Regulus said. Try it again in your dormitory. Practice a few times. He added, but it has to be yours. This is only to let you know in advance what the shield charm feels like. The real shield charm must come from you. Lily nodded several times, then asked cautiously, Do we have to keep this secret? A flash of satisfaction crossed Regulus's face. If it's a friend you trust, you can tell her, he said. There has to be an explanation for where it came from, after all. Lily considered that and smiled. Understood. They packed their books and left together. The corridor was dim. The torches had been lit, their halos flickering on the stone walls. As they stepped out, Lily said, Thank you, Regulus. Between friends, there's no need for thanks, he replied. She muttered, half to herself, "It's always you helping me." Regulus glanced at her, and she broke into a grin. "Goodbye." She hugged her books and ran off, braid bobbing behind her. Regulus watched her disappear around the corridor and then turned to walk the other way. Chapter 217. Old Deng, it's your turn to spend money. During dinner, Regulus kept thinking about that illustrated book he'd looked through earlier. The volume was thick, the pages substantial, and each page had pictures. Most of it was standard fare and didn't take long to finish reading, but one conclusion stuck out. There was no magical plant that could directly replace a humping willow. It wasn't that other plants lacked power. The shadow-like grass, for example, had given him an idea when he read its entry. That grass only glowed in absolute darkness. Its magical affinity seemed to be one of exclusion. If he could isolate that property and develop it into a spell, he might be able to counter his father's shadow magic. The darkness his father created, which suppressed all perception, was essentially an application of exclusion. Turning that attribute into a repelling spell could surprise his father next time he tried the move. Then, Regulus thought of Dumbledore's light. Could dispersing darkness be explained as another form of exclusion? Probably not. Dumbledore was on a different plane. He didn't need to trade one attribute for another. As Dumbledore himself had said, he didn't use one force to counter another so much as remove the reason the darkness existed in the first place. Regulus shook his head. That was a problem for later. Right now, his priorities were elsewhere. No matter how useful shadow-like grass might be, it would be just another trick. What he needed now was the physical pulverization of the Homping Willow to complement the disintegration curse. Professor Sprout had mentioned two magical affinities, conduction and vibration, and Regulus felt there was something deeper there. Conduction pushed force in, vibration detonated it from within. If those two could be combined and developed, the result might be more than simple pulverization. Even conduction alone sparked the imagination, though it still required verification. But the prerequisite was obvious: a humping willow. And since he'd promised not to touch the one at Hogwarts, he had to look elsewhere. He thought of the places humping willows were known to grow: the Bulgarian Magic Sanctuary, the Romanian Dragon Sanctuary, an old manor in southern France, and deep in Germany's Black Forest. With his skills, he could go to these places and bring one home. The problem was the authorities. A sanctuary sounded official. Obtaining a tree through formal channels would be clean, with no noses poking around afterward, no Aurors, no inquiries from the Department of International Magical Cooperation. The last thing he needed was more trouble. With Voldemort watching, Dumbledore observing, and Grindelwald still looming on the horizon, it wasn't worth provoking officialdom just to save a few galleons. If formal means failed and he absolutely had to have one, there was another route. The sanctuary records listed those specimens as wild. If they were wild, they'd simply grown there by chance. It wasn't clear they belonged to the local government. In that case, it would be every man for himself. Regulus sipped his pumpkin juice and chewed a lamb chop as he weighed his options. He would try the formal approach first, buy it outright, and his father would likely back him. 3,000 galleons for the mandrakes had bought him the disintegration curse. His father had seen the spell's power and heard Regulus describe its effects. He knew it wasn't just a strong offensive hex, it could make an opponent vanish from the level of existence. It demonstrated the depth of Regulus's understanding of magic and his ability to transform plants into powerful forces. What family would refuse to pay for that? Even if the price for a humping willow was tens of times higher, it would still be money traded for access to a resource most people couldn't even dream of acquiring. Regulus didn't lack funds, and the House of Black even less so. Even if the cost were raised to 300,000 galleons, it wouldn't be ruinous. Beyond money, the House of Black had political influence and international connections. Orion knew more people than Regulus could name: old friends, ministry sinecures, in-laws, foreign families owing favors. If fully mobilized, that network was formidable. But buying directly from the authorities would play into the seller's hands. Any official who understood the willow's value would hike the price. Orion, as head of the house, would think differently. Rather than bluntly offer to buy a humping willow, He would probe what the Bulgarian Ministry of Magic needed most: supplies, alchemical products, rare materials his family could provide. The House of Black owned shops, mines, herb gardens, and magical creature farms, items the Bulgarian ministry might lack. A trade would be more palatable. To the Bulgarians, a homping willow might be nothing more than a few trees in a sanctuary. To Orion, it was a strategic acquisition. Even if the other side tried to increase the price, his connections would matter. Old favors, family ties, layers of influence. If necessary, they could even approach the landowner directly if the trees technically belonged to private property. Proper negotiation would minimize costs and future headaches. That was the advantage of having Orion in charge. After dinner, Regulus returned to his dorm, pulled parchment and quill from his drawer, and wrote a letter. "Father, I need an adult homping willow. They are found in several places: the Bulgarian Magic Sanctuary, the Romanian Dragon Sanctuary, a manor in southern France, and deep in the Black Forest of Germany. I must have an adult specimen, not a sapling. If possible, I would like it before Christmas. The reason is the same as with the mandrakes: the homping willow complements them. Regulus." He reviewed the note, folded it, and pressed it with his signet. The House of Black crest appeared on the parchment. He walked to the owlery by the astronomy tower. The family owl dozed on its perch but opened one eye and cocked its head when it saw him. Regulus tied the letter to the owl's leg. "Deliver this to father," he said. The owl hooted, flapped, and vanished into the night. Regulus headed downstairs toward the room of requirement. At breakfast the next morning, the great hall was as noisy as ever. Long tables piled with food, owls swooping, papers fluttering. Regulus had only just picked up a piece of toast when a nearby conversation caught his attention. "Look at this," a fifth-year muttered, pointing at a small notice in the Daily Prophet. "The ministry has rejected the appeal for house elf liberation. Same old story." Someone scoffed. "What do they want? Why would house elves want freedom?" "Maybe they're trying to butter up certain people." "But whom? People who don't even own elves." Laughter followed. Regulus glanced at the newspaper. The item was a tiny subhead, buried between a long report on dark wizard attacks and the Quidditch scores. Avery grabbed a copy, skimmed it, and tossed it back without comment, a faint curl at the corner of his mouth. From the Gryffindor table, a voice suddenly rose, booming with indignation. "You say they take pride in labor and shame in freedom? When did they start learning to speak? When did anyone teach them to read? At what point are they told, your value is to serve?" The hall grew quieter. The voice continued, "You keep a living being in a cage from birth and then say it doesn't want to leave. That only proves your cage is strong." Some Hufflepuffs and Gryffindors nodded, others shot back, and an argument flared. Regulus kept eating without turning around. He knew who had spoken. No one else at Hogwarts had that particular righteous heat and impatience with tradition. He wasn't interested in the house elf debate itself. The matter was impossible to resolve now, and the practicalities mattered more. The relationship between wizarding families and their house elves could not simply be labeled slavery. House elves were bound to families, custodians of secrets, recognized by a manor's wards and treated as part of the household, like pieces of furniture, like the ancestral portraits on the walls. Kreacher knew the House of Black's every secret, from Walburga's youthful scandals to the items Orion hid in his study, and even the private magic Regulus practiced down in the family cellar. It was an enslavement, but also a strange symbiosis. Those proposing bills to free the elves were naive. Where would freed house elves go? What could they do? If you shoved them out and said, "You're free," many would be lost. If all elves suddenly remembered their own suppressed wills and sought revenge, wizarding society would tremble. One house elf could disarm an adult wizard. Families with centuries of heritage would never hand their elves over voluntarily. Even if a law passed, enforcement could be avoided by those with influence. So most people treated the idea as a thought exercise and nothing more. Impossible now, and likely the same in 20 years. Regulus finished his breakfast, wiped his mouth, and stood. Avery and the others rose with him. As they left the Great Hall, the Gryffindor argument still raged on. Chapter 218, My Cousin is Getting Married. When Orion pushed open the front door of 12 Grimmauld Place, it was already dawn. He hadn't been home all night. The previous evening, he'd spent at the Malfoy estate talking with Abraxas. On the surface, it had been a social visit between families, but in truth, it had been a meeting of the heads of several core pureblood houses in the Dark Lord's camp, an opportunity to take the temperature and align thinking. They didn't get into specifics on those nights, only sentiments. Abraxas had said the Dark Lord's demands were coming more often and with more urgency, that some families were quietly grumbling but afraid to speak up, and that the Lestranges were becoming dangerously radical. Orion listened, nodded, and kept his answers short. Those signs had been present for a long time and were only growing clearer. He watched Abraxas carefully. Regulus had warned him last year that the current head of the Malfoy house might not live long. He wouldn't die naturally, and that his death would mark the moment the Dark Lord finished consolidating power. The relationship between the Dark Lord and the pureblood families would shift from cooperation to control. Orion had been skeptical then, but he filed the warning away and kept a closer eye on Abraxas at every meeting since. Many times nothing showed, and Abraxas looked the same: gray hair, more wrinkles, but a strong voice and plenty of vigor. He was over a decade older than Orion, so appearances meant little. An experienced wizard could look aged and still possess deep magical reserves. Tonight, however, Orion had the sense that Abraxas was even stronger than before, and it wasn't an act. If he couldn't find a problem, then perhaps there simply wasn't one yet. Regulus had said might, not certainly, so Orion would keep watching. Walking into the dining room, he found Walburga already waiting. She sat in the place of honor, breakfast laid out but untouched. Her eyes followed him as he entered. "You're back?" she demanded. Orion only nodded and went to his seat. Creature appeared silently and set a steaming plate in front of him. Walburga pressed, "How did the talk go?" Orion cut a piece of fried egg. "It was fine." "What do you mean by fine?" she insisted. "What is the attitude of the Malfoy family? What did the Dark Lord say?" He swallowed and answered, "Abraxas said unity between the families is most important. The Dark Lord's cause needs all the pureblood houses to work together." Walburga's face brightened. "Of course, the Malfoys always know how to read the situation." Orion nodded and kept eating. Walburga continued, "And what about honor? Did they mention the House of Black?" "They did," he said. "And what did they say? They called the House of Black the benchmark for pureblood families and said the Dark Lord values us highly." A pleased smile spread across Walburga's face. "Of course, we've always led the way." Orion didn't argue. He listened to her chatter and nodded occasionally. Creature shuffled over again, bowing until his long nose nearly touched the floor. "Master, young Master sent a letter last night," the house elf said respectfully. Orion paused, set down his utensils, and took the envelope. Regulus never wrote without reason. The last letter had been about the Belmont incident. What could this be? A few days ago, he had heard something about Regulus helping a first-year cast a shield charm, guiding the spell on the spot so the child formed a complete barrier. For an ordinary youngster, that might have been showing off, but Regulus never acted without purpose. He was deliberate in everything he did. Now a letter had arrived. Orion wanted to see what it contained. Walburga leaned over. "Regulus wrote? What does he say? Someone at school misbehaved? Or did he win some honor?" Orion scanned the short note. Regulus wanted an adult humping willow, listed a few possible locations, and gave the same rationale he'd used with the mandrake, asking for it to be arranged before Christmas. Orion raised an eyebrow. A humping willow was rare and difficult to obtain, but Regulus had his reasons. No matter how expensive, if he needed it, it was worth it. He folded the letter and handed it back to Creature. "You may go," he said. The house elf bowed deeply and vanished. Walburga, impatient, asked again, "What did Regulus say? Did Slughorn give him house points again, or did he do something extraordinary?" "Slughorn gave him house points," Orion replied. Walburga beamed. "I knew it. Regulus must be outstanding in Slytherin. Which of those children from other pureblood families can compare to him?" Orion nodded without comment. Walburga probed further. "Did he say who provoked him, or whom he taught a lesson?" "No," he said. She grumbled. "This child doesn't write to me, only to you. As his mother, I have to rely on others for everything." Orion said nothing. After breakfast, he rose and went to his study, leaving Walburga talking behind the closed door. He sat behind his desk and leaned back. He was tired. He was getting older, and nights like last night left him feeling the need for caution. He wanted to live a few more years, to see how far Regulus would go, to see how high his son could carry the House of Black. Regulus's letter was short but clear. The humping willow, he said, would complement the mandrake. Orion's mind went to the disintegration curse. His breathing quickened for a moment. He had felt its force when Regulus had used the second form in the study. He'd been made uncomfortable for a long while afterward. Regulus had later said that was only the curse's lowest setting. A spell devised by a 12-year-old, comparable in power to the killing curse, and with even broader applications. What did that mean? That Regulus's grasp of magical power already exceeded what one would expect. It was no longer merely exceptional talent. It was a qualitative difference. Orion thought back to his own youth at Hogwarts. He had been considered excellent then, but compared to Regulus, he fell short. He wondered if Dumbledore had such power as a young man, or if Voldemort had achieved similar mastery at that age. He didn't know. What he did know was that Regulus deserved his full support. The mandrake had cost 3,000 galleons and brought the disintegration curse. Now a humping willow would complement it. He would provide whatever was needed. If money would do it, he'd pay. If he had to trade, he would trade. If neither worked, there were other means he would not hesitate to use. For Regulus, it was worth any price. He sat up, took parchment, and wrote, "Regulus, understood, I will obtain it." He paused, then added a few more lines. "Andromeda's wedding, October 21st. Location, Provence, France, Luberon Mountains, Wisteria Manor. Map attached, thought you might like to know." He folded the letter and summoned Creature. The house elf appeared. "Deliver this to Regulus." Creature took the letter with both hands, bowed, and was gone. Orion leaned back, closed his eyes, and after a moment opened the drawer, took out a list of European magical reserves, and turned to the page on Bulgaria. He began to plan. At Hogwarts, it was lunchtime when Regulus's reply was delivered. An owl dropped the letter onto the plate in front of him, then flew away without waiting for a treat. Regulus brushed crumbs from the flap and opened it. The first line was expected. His father never hesitated on such matters. He read on and raised an eyebrow. Andromeda, his cousin. He realized he hadn't seen her in nearly 2 years. Of his 3 cousins, she was the one he had least contact with, and yet she had been the kindest to him. Before his first year at Grimmauld Place, Andromeda had said to him, "Don't let compromise turn into surrender. Don't let this family consume you. You have a heart of your own. Remember that." When she left, she had added, "If one day you need real help, find me. I'll be in France." Last Christmas, Regulus had had Creature deliver a key to a Gringotts vault in Paris to her. Of his 3 cousins, he cared most for Andromeda, not out of calculation or family advantage, but because of her frankness, courage, and steady refusal to be molded by the house. She didn't resist the family by open rebellion like Sirius. She quietly chose her own path and accepted the consequences. She had given advice and left a promise. She was someone he could trust. Now she was getting married. Regulus looked at the simple sketch of a map. It was roughly drawn, only a few lines and circles, but as he stared, he could see the place. The Luberon Mountains, a stone house at the foot of the hill, vines crawling over the walls, fields of lavender nearby. He would be able to find Wisteria Manor. He folded the letter, slipped it into his pocket, and went to eat.